Hello everyone, it's Niz. I want to try to do something a bit new with this one, something I probably won't do often, but I think would be fun. The reasons for the scarcity I think will be apparent. I would have to play them both thoroughly, and still have plenty to say about both titles, which can be differentiated from one another. Though I can think of a few other examples of a few games that may end up being an occurrence in the future, it will naturally be more rare. But you can rest assured that when I do this, I'll have ample reason to, and plenty to talk about, judging from the length of this video. So let's go ahead and compare the differences between Wasteland 2 and Wasteland 3. To start, I want to go ahead and set the stage with a bit of dev history. I'm going to give a very abridged version of the Interplay timeline, but I think it's going to be useful for giving a bit of context on how these games ended up in very different states, figuratively, though you could also say literally. Interplay was founded in the 80s, and had its fingers in a few famous CRPG pies, but we're going to focus on Wasteland, which was made by Interplay, directed by one of the big names in the dev team at the time, Brian Fargo. This game was one of the oldest releases in the category of Western CRPGs, and one could tell with the technological limitations of being essentially a text-based adventure game with a few more bells and whistles. The game Fountain of Dreams, which was initially meant to be Wasteland 2, wasn't very well received. In fact, according to accounts on the matter, nobody from the original team worked on it, and you can kind of tell with the lore. The thing that would be considered the true spiritual successor would be Fallout, and as you all may know, Fallout went the way of 40k and became exponentially more popular than the thing it would be based off of. Interplay was booming around this point, and according to Tim Kaine, tensions raised between the team and Fargo during the development of 2. I won't go into great detail on the matter, I don't have Brian's perspective, but Tim Kaine does go over his point of view on his channel. Either or, this eventually leads to a lot of members of Interplay leaving after the creation of the second game. Interplay eventually had most of its stakes bought out by Titus Interactive, and Brian Fargo also made his leave. Interplay suffered more financially, leading to them eventually having to sell their rights to Fallout to Bethesda. But we can get off the Interplay history train from here, because in 2002, Brian Fargo founded In Exile, a new team with a few of the old members from Interplay that bought the rights to Wasteland and made a Kickstarter for making Wasteland 2. Now, keeping in mind that this was a 2010s Kickstarter, which is a much sketchier environment than I would say it is now. There's still plenty of scams out there, but it's a lot easier to discern them now that the legit projects have a common sense of guidelines on how to prove that they're actually trying to make something. Plus, there's been a lot more socially established caution and standards for Kickstarters before people invest. There was no guarantee that those would get funded. Admittedly, they were lucky they had the nostalgia points to get backing at the time of trying to develop this game. Other titles like Shadowrun Returns were also able to appeal to such an audience. It was up to the winds of fate when In Exile came out and essentially said, hey, the proto Fallout we made 20 years ago, we want to make a sequel, and we want this one to be an ISO RPG akin to Fallout Tactics. Except good. And apparently there was a market for that. It's kind of amusing reading how this all came to be from the perspective of someone who stumbled across the final product in 2014 thanks to the Indie Box program they had. I'm in my 20s and just happened to stumble across it a good while after getting into Fallout 3, and I wasn't particularly familiar with isometric RPGs at the time I acquired it. I barely got through 2/3 of Fallout 1, and without spoiling too much, Wasteland 2 isn't particularly friendly to newcomers of the genre. Yet it would seem when the third game came out, I was more than eager to give it a shot, although I did miss the Kickstarter on that one too. And I got news that they were working with Microsoft now. I ended up playing both to quite a bit of a degree, and I've honestly developed an attachment to the setting, hence the creation of this video. There's quite a bit to dissect in these games, and I think would be fun to cover. I'll get this out of the way, in hopes of not priming people and letting them decide for themselves, but I do think Wasteland 2 is the better of the titles, and to a heavy degree. But this won't be just a video bashing on 3 in comparison. Trust me, it still has its own merits despite the faults in it. A couple things before we move on. I will be reviewing specifically Wasteland 2's Director's Cut, and Wasteland 3, including its DLC. I feel it's necessary to point out because DC gives Wasteland 2 a ton of quality of life changes, but also has a few bugs unrelated. In the description's a link to a zip file that will allow you to put Gary Wolfe into the game, considering he's basically impossible to spawn normally in Director's Cut. And also, I consider 3's DLC a part of the final package, so I think it should be included in the analysis by extension. I will be basing the majority of my discussion on the mechanics and balance around Season difficulty of 2 and the Wastelander difficulty of 3, as those are the difficulties that the other difficulties use as a reference point for modifiers. Therefore, I will assume that they are the base difficulty and the intended experience. Some footage will be on Supreme Jerk as I test out certain things to their extreme, but don't worry too much about that. The goal ultimately is to compare what the game expects you to be playing. But with all of that addressed, it's best that we start going over the actual games, as there's a lot that I want to cover, starting with gameplay. There is a lot to dissect with the difference of these two games, and going over character creation is going to be a huge part in explaining this because, like many good RPGs, the core is built with said creation in mind. It might come off as a little confusing or distracting when I start going over side tangents of certain features whenever certain skills are introduced, but trust me, I'll be doing so when they become relevant to how the game's tied together character creation and their respective mechanics. Let's start with the selection screen. Wasteland 2 and 3 have drastically different approaches for the player, and it's perfectly presented here. Wasteland 3 will create 2 rangers, with the pre-made ones readily available and pairing off with skills they think the player can make use of. You have to go out of your way to make custom rangers. 2 can give you a pre-made squad, but makes you pick between that and making your own rather than defaulting to it. It also has you making a squad of up to 4 rangers. You may have noticed in my wording that I said in 3, you were given either 2 pre-made rangers or 2 custom rangers to make, while in the second game, you are given up to 4. You can create anywhere between 1 to 4 rangers, with any combination of pre-mates in between said combinations, and if you want to adjust things of said pre-made characters, you can. The game doesn't really tell you if there's any benefits of having less than a squad of 4, there isn't, but you have the freedom to adjust how many of the squad mates that you have full control over are ones that you've created, ones that are pre-made, and ones that will be empty slots that are taken up by spots of characters spawned in the world, who also have their own unique backstories that aren't readily available in the pre-made squad screen. I think this perfectly sums up the dichotomy between the two games in a role-playing aspect. Wasteland 2's approach is a lot more complex, in-depth, but also potentially daunting to new players, and they don't know all the consequences of these things or just how much certain parts will affect their gameplay experience. While 3 is a lot more approachable and clear in its intent, but with this simplicity comes a reduction with player expression that 2 carries. To really emphasize this complexity, I'm going to go over the character attributes. Bear with me, because I'm also going to go over mechanics tied to the attributes as mentioned earlier, but you may notice that I'll also skip other mechanics. This will depend on how much each mechanic bleeds over into things that will be relevant to other subjects. These stats are coordination, luck, awareness, strength, speed, intelligence, and charisma. Fun fact, much like the Fallout's attributes being the acronym SPECIAL, Wasteland 2 and 3's attributes deliberately spell out CLASSIC, as a tongue-in-cheek detail that their IP is the original. The first thing I noticed when playing 3 was that you get 21 attribute points, including the default 1 point in every stat, which is comparably a lot less than 2, which gave you 28. Basically getting 1 less point across the board for every stat. I came to learn that this was because you get an attribute point every level ignoring the first 2, which is kind of mind-boggling to me because the previous game, you would get an attribute point every 10 levels. So to break it down, in Wasteland 2, if you're doing most of the content, finding relics, interacting with your fellow rangers at the Citadel and doing their side quests, before reaching the second half of the game, by the end point, you can reach the mid to high 30s in the levels. My latest run was around 38 without New Game Plus, so I could safely say that your total attributes by endgame for 2 is 31, not including modifiers from trinkets. In Wasteland 3, there's a weird soft cap at level 20, which makes it harder to progress past those levels. The best I could do without grinding random encounters was around mid-20s, so we'll say 25, which would be equal to around 44 attribute points, give or take. So it seems here that Wasteland 2, you pretty much set a build in stone when it comes to attributes. Then it gives you a few extra points to mess around with and expand throughout the game, while 3 gives humble beginnings. So humble that's actually kind of hard to make something really defining from the start. The other stats have to do heavy lifting in that regard. But the third game also likes to scale the player hard, and I think that's indicative of many of their decisions for attributes in the third game. One I really want to go over is squad scaling. In Wasteland 2, if you had scaled your recruitables before you got them, tough luck, which is kind of rough because this system means you not only have to run into these characters in the area at the ideal time to, and for some that goes incredibly smoothly, but for others you could completely miss them until a good 10 levels later. It's also rough because they have preset builds and attributes, skills and perks that you have to factor into your squad as you recruit them. Easier done on repeated playthroughs, but you could find a guy you like, but he is completely incompatible with your team because he's using a skill list you already have and don't need multiple people trained in. In 3, it's different. There's a respec system that allows you to reallocate the skills of your rangers and companions alike. This allows you to optimize synergy, which I have mixed feelings on. It allows you to use whoever you like best no matter your comp, but also robs the character of part of what makes them that character. Companions being set in stone I think makes them more identifiable to the world that they are in, rather than being readjusted for the player characters to make them more compatible. The squad scaling comes into play when we include the squad mates that aren't present will automatically level up to the squad's average level range when brought back in. Since they will only let you drop to a squad of 2, You can just bank all your XP bonuses on 2 rangers, give them skills that you have to use constantly for bonus XP, have them get the level lead, remove all your squad mates, bring them back into the squad, then boom, they're all the same level. Another exploit is that the skill books that are in 2 and 3 that give you an instant level in the skill they're based around. Well, this is less of an exploit and more of a mechanic, because if you use those books at level 10, you get the most bang for your buck. Obvious, right? Since there's a respec system, you could have someone read up on a bunch of books, then respec the skill points, and the skill point transfer will give you 6 skill points for free per book that you can put anywhere. Now, it wouldn't make us think about it if it wasn't for how Wasteland 3 seems to see skill points. In their defense, respec does increase costs, but you can get a good 4 or 5 times before the respec gets real high. And you have full control over the first 4 characters in creation. But before we get too deep into skills, it's better that we go ahead and tackle it at its core and cover attributes. So, going down the list, coordination in Wasteland 2 affects your total action points, giving 1 for every 2 points you have in coordination, as well as slightly boosting the accuracy of range by 1% for every point past 1. In 3, coordination is identical in regards of given AP, but grants a moderate amount of stats effect resist chance instead of range accuracy, giving up to a 25% chance that any stats effect listed here will not take hold when getting hit by it. In both scenarios, coordination is a strong stat. For those not aware of a combat system that uses AP, action points dictate how much you can do in your turn. Attacks, movements, and interacting with things cost varying amounts of AP, so the more the better. But despite only their secondary stat boost changing, AP is drastically different in these 2 games. You see, in Wasteland 2, everyone has a base AP of 3. When you create a character, it'll say 6 because of the baseline of 3 across the board before you mess with it. One of the AP is coming from you having 3 in coordination, and the other 2 is from an equation that adds up your speed, strength, and intelligence, then divides it by 4. So for every 4 points you have total in the SSI of Classic, you'll get 1 action point. So you're going to be expected to invest in some AP one way or another, but you could end up with a ranger build so bad that your sniper is physically incapable of firing the gun. The idea here is that there's incentive to build into other things and you won't horrendously miss out on AP, but you will miss out in some regards because in terms of AP, building coordination is always more efficient. This has coordination be something you build into, but far from overbearing if you're efficient with your weapon selection, perks, and quirks. You can max out your coordination, but you don't need to. In 3, this equation doesn't exist. You can only get AP via attributes through coordination. This means that coordination has a monopoly on AP when it comes to character building, and to compensate for that, they made a ton of sources that grant players more AP, and then gave them 6 on base. So as a result, it becomes insanely good to invest into to stack a ton of high cost attacks into a ranger, or simply apply more effects as you hit more low costing attacks. And also in 3, there's just so much more you can do with leftover AP, it doesn't become nearly as wasteful to have an amount that leaves you short an extra attack. Luck is actually a bit of a weird one. I have trouble with luck stats in a lot of RPGs on the count of, the save button. I've always thought it was better to simply not have a luck stat because it would usually be something other than luck or it'd be difficult to make balanced. Wasteland 2 makes my point. It raises the crit chance by 1% for 10% and raises evasion every 2 points up to 5%. Luck also allows the player to have a small chance of gaining 1 additional AP per turn and a roll to gain more max HP per level. It also has a few secret bonuses I guess it didn't feel the need to list, including affecting party loot and increasing the successful rate of skill checks. I haven't noticed the difference in drops for luck builds, and we'll get to the skill check segment a bit later. To put simply, every single feature that luck provides is inconsistent, the rates are low, and even if you're lucky with the rolls, other stats can do the same thing better at the cost of less points. You gain more evasion from good positioning, and weapons have their own skill and crit rate with their skill, where the ones that need them more already have a very good rate, an undeniable dump stat unfortunately. Wasteland 3 however knocked it out of the park with the luck stat. Luck increases penetration by 1 for every 2 points, giving an additional 2 at 10, up to plus 6 penetration. We'll go over the penetration in armor later, but it also gives a 1% per point for a lucky action to occur, which instead of rolling per turn, it rolls per action. Instead of getting 1 AP, it refunds all AP spent on that lucky action. This can be incredibly powerful and can enable some really wild sprees and potential chains without making it a reliable option. Luck gets its own critical chances going up to 10%, but also has an exclusive mega crit function at the same rate, giving you a lot of rolls for it to occur on any attack. Mega crits are triple your normal crits, giving you a strong chance of hitting like a truck when using certain weapons, adding up crit multipliers, which in comparison, crits are based on ranger instead of weapon in 3. When I say that, I'm referring to their critical hit chance. The crit multipliers of weapons vary, typically based off of weapon category, but rangers also modify that within their attribute we'll be going into later. You can also have a 20% chance of crit healing and mega crit healing, which arguably isn't as valuable, as healing in Wasteland 3 is a lot more powerful due to the fact that healing is based off your maximum health. But far more frequently occurring can be useful in a pinch, I suppose. There's also a plus 20% evasion rate, a plus 20% crit resistance when maxed out, crit resistance being a chance of getting hit by a critical hit and taking 0 damage, and a 5% chance of getting double money and scrap from drops respectively. This is why I think a luck stat should be, if you were to include one, a bunch of really powerful bonuses that can outperform others more reliable stats, but aren't consistent enough to bank on alone. They are low chance and inconsistent, making it not rewarding enough for people who want to save and outright abuse the mechanic. But there are so many sources for huge boons of success coming from all these separate roles that luck still has a sense of value, an improvement in both power and balance, and I'm glad to see it. It's really easy to sleep on awareness, not realizing how good it actually is, especially in 2. It slightly increases the sight radius of perception checks every 2 levels. It also gives up to plus 5% evade chance. It also has something special, a plus 1 to combat initiative for every point in it, and veterans know that combat initiative is a money stat. Turn order is calculated by combat initiative. Those going higher get to act first. And if you have a high enough combat initiative over other individuals, you can actually get an additional turn before they act. This naturally gives you an insane amount of control over a combat scenario, and is probably why you see build guides for snipers to have brittle bones and a ton of awareness. In Wasteland 3, awareness raises perception by 1 every 2 points, and an additional 2 at 10, adding a plus 6. Raises hit chance by 1% per point while adding a plus 3 on the 10th, so it's a 12% total. And boosts the range damage by 3% per point, except for 10, which raises it by 8%, making it a 35% extra range damage. You've heard perception in both examples, and it is worth differentiating, because in 2, perception was a skill to spot certain details on items, people, areas of the map, hidden loot. In 3, perception is its own stat that can be raised by awareness, trinkets, unique armor, and does effectively the same thing, except it's mostly discovering traps and hidden pathways. You may also have noticed a lot of Wasteland 3 attributes add a power spike at their stats at level 10. This will be a frequent occurrence, and I'm sorry if it sounds long-winded, but I do think it's necessary to point out when listing said stats, especially for attributes where the most important stat gets a power spike. So back to 3's awareness. The range damage and hit chance pretty much secure this as just the range attribute. You can have awareness on a melee character, but having it on a melee character is a waste of time. You only need one ranger that has perception in either game. But in 3, there's even less incentive if you don't have a gun. Some people might find strength to be a bit strange in Wasteland 2, as it doesn't raise your melee damage directly, but does have a lot of useful traits. Every point in strength raises the player's base HP by 3, from 17 to 44. Every 2 levels in strength also makes it so that the player gets extra HP per level, and this effect is retroactive. So if you raise strength by 2 throughout the game and are at level 20, you'll get an additional 20 max HP from the effect, plus the extra 6 health they get from the base health boost. In 2, players can get pretty tanky, but people who dump it aren't entirely doomed. At minimum, you will always get 7 health per level, and at maximum, you will always get 12 per level. Someone with 2 strength will have around 280 HP, not including base, while someone with 10 will be rocking around 450. This gap closes rapidly if you put 2 more points in strength, making it well over the 300 range. And honestly, in an average set of rangers, you won't notice that much of a difference health-wise, but said gap can mean all the difference for avoiding death and rejoining fights, as I'll get into later. Not to mention that this will allow your rangers to wear heavier armor to mixed effect, which I'll also be getting into later. Trust me, these topics coincide with a ton of other things that I'm saving for combat. Strength also affects carrying capacity, since Wasteland 2 has individual inventories that have to be managed among the squad. Anyone who tried to dump strength in their squad had to learn the hard way how much harder that makes it to loot, carry secondary weapons, backup weapons, and emergency explosives. All things that'll make your life substantially easier, and it can range from 57 to 165, not including trinkets, or the perk to raise capacity, which also scales with your strength. It can't be understated. 2 points in strength is pretty much the difference between you carrying an extra rocket launcher, and you want to divvy those up between your squad. The last effect, and a bit of a strange one in application, is bonus critical damage multiplier for melee. The reason this is weird is that it means melee really isn't what you need to build for blunt melee rangers, because crits with blunt are already huge, but it has a super low crit rate. Blade weapons, on the other hand, max out around 60 with a lower multiplier, so it could use the boost. But if we really want to talk about melee strength, we get on to brawling. It's pretty much mandatory because all the damage depends on crits. That one I understand more. Don't get me wrong, Wasteland 2 vets can rock a 10 strength blunt ranger and completely wreck house late game, but the very stat is in a very odd place for melee weapons. But I gotta say, I appreciate that it's the one direct damage boost in all of the attributes, and that's specialized so that strength is an okay generalist attribute, but has plenty of room for melee builds. I almost wanted to skip 3 strength, calling it awareness but for melee and call it a day, but that also kind of ignores other things about this attribute that I think deserves analysis. Strength gives plus 5 base health per level, but it gives an additional 30 at 10. So up to 75. But it also gives plus 3 health per level for every 2 points. No, you're hearing that right. So some may be wondering why there's this insane leap in health scaling compared to 2. Well, like AP, the difference is due to the base effects. In 2, you start with a base of 7 HP per level. In 3, if you only have 1 point of strength, you only get 1 HP per level, while max level rangers will be rocking 15 per level. And again, I get it. This is the most extreme version of the gap. The game's gonna assume everyone is going to put at least some points of strength, but even a 4-point difference has this huge gap between the 10-point power spike. The raw 30 health you get along with the plus 5 HP per level basically means it nearly doubles your health scaling bonus compared to every other 2 levels. We'll go over more why that's a big deal in the combat section. The strength attribute in 3 also gives a melee damage bonus, 3% per level, 8% at 10th rank, and that's 35% increase when maxed. Yeah, awareness. So if your priority is melee, this is basically a money stat because it increases the base damage of your melee weapons, which allows it to boost it with a bunch of other modifiers. The last change that it gets is that it increases throwing range by 0.1 meter per level and adds 0.2 at the 10th level for some reason, making it a 1.1 throwing meter distance bonus. This sounds incredibly unimpressive, I know, but that throw range can actually make a huge difference on where you can use throwables and deploy items without having to reposition. It's not what you're here for, but I can see practicality behind, I don't know, having a ranger with a quick slot deployable build. Hey, no, later. Let's move on to speed. Speed is the stat that has changed the absolute least. Rather, it's the values around it seem to have changed. So we'll be going over a couple game mechanics in this one. In 2, every point of speed increases combat speed by 0.1. Combat speed is a stat that affects the maximum tiles a player can cover with 1 AP while in combat. If someone were to have a combat speed of 1, you can spend 1 AP and travel 1 tile. But if a person had a 5 combat speed, you can go up to 5 tiles with a single AP. But if someone had a 2.5, you could go 2 tiles with 1 AP, but it's not rounded. So by the 3rd tile, you'd be spending 2 AP, but you can travel up to 5 per movement action while only spending 2. If your combat speed is atrocious, you might be burning a ton of AP you should be using on attacks just trying to reposition. When it comes to 2, the speed attribute can be pretty useful in this regard because there are incredibly few ways to increase your combat speed. There's 1 trinket, 1 quirk, 1 perk, and that makes you faster the first turn. 1 perk that makes you less slow while wearing heavy armor, which depending on your approach can be handy, as there are a lot more things in Wasteland 2 that can decrease combat speed outside of heavy armor. There are a few trinkets, quirks, and carrying rocket launchers, not to even include negative stats effects, though I'm certain there's plenty of arguments to be made that combat speed's not really that important, especially if you're a ranged ranger, due to how heavily you can modify firing distance and set your own optimal ranges. Although a lot of things that can affect combat speed can be thoroughly controlled by experienced rangers, so it's usually best to set your character's speed to a full number or 0.5 to get the most out of your skill in that regard. It also gives 0.5 combat initiative, which we already went over why CI is so good. Although it's only half as effective as awareness, it may be worth dipping into just for that alternate source. However, in Wasteland 3, much like getting additional AP, there's a ton more factors that come into play for combat speed. Unarmed skill training gives combat speed, early game leg armor gives combat speed, blast knuckles give combat speed, there's more perks that give combat speed, armor mods that boost combat speed, and there's a strong combat speed cybernetic if you want to sell your soul to the Metal Devil. I shouldn't be so venomous, we haven't even gotten to lore yet. Some of you probably thought that was unprompted. The point is, there's a ton more outside sources for combat speed, which I think makes up for the fact that the base combat speed in both games are the same. But, you guessed it, this time giving you a 0.5, making your total combat speed 2.8. So it's really easy to cover a ton of ground when committing to it. Next is ironing out how Wasteland 3 covers combat initiative, because I talked about it quite a bit in 2, but 2 is individual based, while 3 is team based. So how it goes from my understanding is if you catch an enemy by surprise, it burns the AP used by that character's action, but your team automatically goes first. Otherwise, it does checks to see which team goes first based off of initiative modifiers affected by speed. I don't know if it's a roll or if they calculate it. I don't know if it goes off the average of the team or the highest modifier. The game doesn't really explain how initiative rolls work, or how a lot of things work for that matter. The important part is that one team goes first, and you can alternate between teammates at any given time. This is kind of a double-edged sword because it means that powerful and consistent initiative orders of certain squad mates won't come into play as often, nor the strategization of killing an enemy that gets a turn just before one of your allies would. But it does mean it's a lot easier to coordinate abilities, which the third game is a lot more dependent on. I'll go over why it's such a big deal to go first in Wasteland 3 later in combat. Just know that these are factors that make initiative work differently between the two games. Simple but important for later. And just in case you thought we were done with mechanical tangents, we're on to the evasion speed provides. In both games, speed is a money stat for evasion. However, evasion modifiers in 2 were drastically lower than 3. Where in 2, speed's evasion is +1 per level, the third game is +3% per level, and gives an extra 6% on level 10, going up to 33. In Wasteland 2, they make it pretty clear that if you miss position, you have to expect they're gonna get shot. If any enemy closes melee range, you can expect them to hit you, even if they don't have particularly high hit chances. While in 3, it encourages dodgy builds. If you really commit, you can have over 40% evasion rate early game without even including cover or a smoke grenade. But you're still going to need those because I unfortunately have no confirmation on enemy hit chance in 2, but 3 was kind enough to be informative in that regard. And the hit chance of enemies is very frequently above 100% accuracy, so you can tell with this, lucky evasion chance, and crit resistance that Wasteland 3 encourages a lot more dodge tanking if you commit. High combat speed means closing the gap more often, obviously, and when you're in melee range, you're typically out of cover or in a flanked position. While in Wasteland 2, your melee characters were expected to be tanky. Next up, intelligence. Oh, have mercy, look at how they massacred my boy. Some people might argue that intelligence was a vapid yet overpowered attribute in the second game. For every 4 points you have in intelligence, you get an additional skill point per level, and at 10, you would also get an additional skill point. So the chart of +1 intel skilling was 4, 8, and 10. Remember when I said on average you could hit the mid-30s by the end of a thorough Wasteland 2 run? Well, consider that it takes a total of 44 skill points to max out a skill, meaning that assuming you use a designated skill book of whatever skill you're leveling once you reach level 9, it'll only take around 36 skill points to max it out. Much more plausible, especially if you're searching for shrines which grant more XP and also sometimes give you a skill point for the entire party. In practice, this effectively means you'll be able to max out a skill for each bonus skill point that you scale with. This means that skill monkeys will not only get the hang of their skills faster, but access later perks of weapons faster, end up scaling in accuracy and crit chance faster, and have more options for powerful perks to dip into. I won't lie, I also thought intelligence was a little overpowered. The con is, unlike Strength's max health boost, intelligence skill points aren't retroactive, which means that the early game intelligence is significantly more valuable. So whoever you set your intelligence for when it comes to the starting squad is probably what you'll stick for the rest of the game. Intelligence's main theme is powerful but inflexible. This also leads to a funny effect for some of your companions because you'll see someone like Ralphie or Scotchmo and see that 3 intelligence and go, I can fix them, and then drop a 4th point in there once they hit level 10. But then you'll see a smart character like Lexcanium and Lament because he has 7, but he's exactly level 20 on recruitment. So in short, a lot of good build guides give you radio chatter when you ask how to build intelligence on a ranger. 10-4. Go 10 intelligence because if you're committing 4 points for another skill, you might as well drop the extra 2 for 1 more. While putting in 4 is a far more reasonable commitment to your average ranger, but still gives you a lot more room and skill points that you wouldn't have otherwise. Not everyone in your squad needs to be a max intelligence build. There is such thing as redundant skills after all. 1 or 2 max intelligence rangers is usually more than enough. If I were to balance this, the only thing I would do is swap the AP equation with luck. Intelligence doesn't have to give you AP. It should be a huge sacrifice for the commitment in my opinion. Luck would still suck, mind you, but at least it would have something going for it. Speaking of luck, in Wasteland 3, that's basically what intelligence is, another luck stat, but it's a crit attribute way. It gives 2% crit chance per level up to 20%, raises crit multiplier by 1.1 per level, with a 0.2 at level 10 making an additional 1.1 crit multiplier. Critical heal chance increases by 2% per level like crit chance, but has a rank 10 power spike with a plus 7% chance, making it max out at plus 25% chance crit heal, and an identical crit heal power increase of 25%, which is pretty useless because the aforementioned super high heal rates. The crit chance and damage multiplier is handy, don't get me wrong, not to spoil too much about the combat section, but Wasteland 3 is quite the fan of stacking damage multipliers. It also gives 1 skill point per level on intelligence. I will repeat that to make sure there's no mistake here. An additional skill point, just a flat point, not per level. What, pray tell, am I supposed to do with 9 more skill points in my run? I will be fair, it costs 28 skill points to max out a skill in Wasteland 3 as opposed to Wasteland 2's 44, and with a book at level 9, you could drop that down to about 22. But that still means that maxing intelligence will only give you enough skill points to get from rank 1 to 5 in a single skill, as opposed to every major stage of intelligence at level 1 pretty much securing you a maxed out skill. The skill point bonus honestly feels like it was tacked on as a consolation. Wasteland 3 has such a strict level cap, it was pretty obvious how far they want your rangers to go skill-wise, and what better time to bring up level ups when charisma is the last on the list. Wasteland 2 Charisma is kind of weird. It's a lot more useful when you know the ropes of the game, and what to recruit specific followers that have a certain charisma pool threshold. And by useful, I mean you'll understand the exact amount of charisma you would want to make them spawn. A little less than half of the companions have a charisma requirement, but also most of those characters only spawn if you pick a certain decision that will lock others from appearing. Honestly, unless you have one charisma across the board with every starting ranger, you'll probably meet the requirement of most of them without even trying. Charisma also gives leadership range, starting at 0, and going up 2 meters per point past 1, which means yes, you could quite literally build a leader ranger, dump charisma, and as a result, their leadership skill is useless. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about what the leadership skill does. It raises the accuracy of all rangers in the area of influence based on how many points you have in leadership. And companions inside the leadership field also reduce chance of going rogue. Going rogue isn't as bad as it sounds. They'll simply act in their own volition during a turn in combat, which typically means that they'll use their selected weapon to attack an enemy within range as they please, and rush into melee distance if they have their melee out. Of course, it can still very much be an issue when you're trying to coordinate precise plays, and allies simply won't comply, and that universal extra accuracy certainly comes in handy as well. So that leadership range bonus, it gives you a bit more flexibility to exert those benefits. The other effect of charisma is giving 5% extra XP per point put into it from all sources not related to combat, going all the way up to a 50% bonus. Honestly, with my leader with a large charisma gap between them and the other squad mates, I only managed to get my leader a couple levels ahead of them. It would probably be more if I ran a leader who disabled mines or healed allies so their bonus XP would proc more often, but part of me thinks that the charisma XP bonus is there to help even out the field, that you're putting a lot of points in what otherwise would be a dump stat. In Wasteland 3, charisma got something akin to the intelligence treatment due to it being a less combat-focused attribute, but since intelligence was super good and charisma was the second dump stat, it got the opposite treatment and being transformed into a very strong combat stat that also got to keep its old benefits and have stuff added onto it. Charisma increases a new mechanic called Strike, which is basically the ranger's ultimate ability, adding a plus 2% per level, but a plus 4 at rank 10. But know that something as small as a plus 2% to your strike rate is still huge. There's a wiki chart that covers it. The difference in amount of attacks it requires to get your charge ability drastically changes on the charisma attribute. It makes charisma an insanely powerful combat stat because it lets you use a lot of heavy hitting AoEs. I'll go more into that later. Strikes also allow you to do singular, guaranteed to hit attacks with precision weapons, with damage multipliers depending on which body part you aim for, as well as a percentage chance to cause an additional effect. Effects varying from alright to useless to instantly killing the enemy.
Just in case, this is very unlikely to occur, I'll point out that Federico has 1,635 health. And
yeah,
my filter's not on. Currently recording. Let's see if the flame tank fucking... Yeah! Okay, there we go.
It also has a leadership range of 2 meters, going up by 2 per level and giving a plus 4 at level 10, maxing out at 22 meters. Companions don't go rogue anymore, but leadership gets a bunch of other stuff that makes the boosted range well worth it. As if the strike rate wasn't enough, charisma grants a plus 2 XP bonus per level, and a plus 12 at level 10? Well, that's a gigantic leap. Even more than usual for attributes. I think it might be they realized charisma kind of peters out at level 7 in Realms of Strike Rate. This is really strange because this ironically kind of makes charisma the new intelligence build, because you'll want to put it on someone like a locksmith, someone who will do a ton of checks and grant them XP that gives them a spike in levels early game before hitting that level 20 wall. Depending on how big the gap becomes from there, you might get a couple levels ahead of other rangers in that range, which is honestly not much in terms of skill points, but maybe the extra perks will come in handy. The last bonus is a plus 1 bonus to mission rewards for every level. I really don't know what to say about this. It's by far the least impactful attribute effect in the game, from my experience. There's more arguments for crit healing than this. Okay, fantastic, we've gotten over attributes and it's time to move on to skills. No, I'm not going to cover each and every skill. I covered attributes that way because they're the very core of every character, or at least intended to be. Instead, I want to talk more about the framework with some skills as examples. So it certainly still won't be short. I'm going to be spending a lot of time fawning over Wasteland 2's skill system. As mentioned in the intelligence section, each skill in Wasteland 2 requires 44 skill points to max out. There are 29 skills in total, 10 specifically for weapons, and 19 for more specializing your rangers, mostly out of combat. There's also 2 secret skills. One is a Kickstarter skill that gives players more flavor text for world building. Here's the special code you have to interact with the person with to get. It's been a decade, I don't think anybody's gonna care that you learn more lore. And the other one is an in-joke for Wasteland 1 called combat shooting. But instead of doing absolutely nothing like it did in the original game, it raises all crit chance by 10% per level you put into it, and it's already maxed out. It's also a very easy skill to miss, and you can only acquire it once per run. But knowing that you can have up to 7 rangers in a squad, it means that your team has to divvy up around 19 skills between them. So roughly 3 non-combat skills on average each. Mind you, there are some skills where you very much need to overlap, either because they're just that useful, they complement certain builds, or they have an early perk that's just amazing. But usually in these cases, you only need one person to build heavily into it, and anyone else just needs to dip. There's also some skills you really don't have to invest into, but sure would make things more convenient if you did. And a couple of skills you don't really lose much at all skipping. That's one of the things I love about Wasteland 2. The more you play it, the more you come to realize how important some skills are and aren't. And just because a skill is super important doesn't necessarily mean that you have to max it out or even build highly into it. You really see this in weapon categories. It's usually super important to vary up your weapons in Wasteland 2 because you're going to want a wide array of optimal ranges and ammo used. There's also the training system that I think is worth mentioning. Not that there's some sort of vendor that you can train with, but that no matter what weapon you're using, the first skill point is the most important because the first point means that you're trained in the weapon and gives you the first 50% hit rate that you need to even fight with said weapon. Other levels past that vary in importance depending on the weapon. Like for example, brawling weapons don't get to see the true potential in its scaling until you commit to it because it gets a lot more crit chance per level compared to other weapons, or how shotgun's most powerful gimmick utilizing the free fire mode isn't fully realized till you get enough points into it to get the perk that causes it to power spike. But perks are a different category of analysis, so more on that later. Meanwhile, you really don't need to commit a lot to pistol. It's meant to be low range, cheap AP, and easy to apply debuffs with. There are definitely certain weapon categories that have been made in mind to be treated as a sidearm, and there are benefits to having something that's circumstantial when it isn't your plan A. But what about the general and knowledge skills and skill checks? Wasteland 2 also has what is probably my favorite skill check system in any RPG I've played. Yes, it's unironically competing with Disco Elysium in my head. And a large part of that is execution. Any check that isn't persuasion is percentage based, and it's weighed by your skill's rank and the difficulty level. But the game rolls a couple of things when you do the check, whether you critically fail or succeed, and whether you fail or succeed. The fact that it rolls criticals before final result is important. It's a bit confusing at first, but failed skill checks are actually a neutral state. It just means that you get to do the check again to try to succeed. You don't get any drastic consequences for failure unless you crit fail, and the chances of critical failure raise a great amount based on the difference in skill difficulty and skill rank. When the skill's rank is lower than the difficulty, the odds of critical failure are super high and sometimes even higher than the odds of success. I've taken the liberty of making a crude chart to show off how both scale. You may notice percentages being a little different than that, and that's because of a hidden luck modifier I mentioned earlier. It raises the success rate of all skill checks by 1% per level in luck. It's painfully pathetic, especially when you realize it still doesn't affect crit fail chance, which as mentioned before, the game checks if you crit fail or crit succeed before anything else. So your minor luck effect could be vetoed by an unfortunate roll beforehand. Man, luck just doesn't get to have anything. But because of how decreasing the gap between difficulty level and skill prioritizes decreasing the crit fail rate, and the execution had multiple skill checks layered in a single object, many of which need to be dealt with in a correct order, it's not uncommon for locked objects to have booby traps and or alarms attached to them. Clearing up the trap and alarm are obviously the top priority before unlocking the safe or chest. You may find a device that requires computer science to operate, but the hardware is too damaged and requires mechanical repair before you can even boot it up. This array of expertise gives more room for party members to have their skills pitch in. It makes it feel more like a team effort, and that's not just strength in numbers in combat, but a variety of practical skills to make your squad so strong. An example of this being so great is having a ranger who's a lockpicking expert, and another who's a mechanic. You try to open a chest with a challenge level 5 with a lockpicking rank of 5. Seems reasonable enough. Oh, you crit failed. The chest is broken.
Dude.
Well, I guess you could reload your save, or you could have your ally pitch in with his mechanical repair skill. You built the mechanic to be a bit more of a skill monkey, so his mechanical repair is 6, and you repair the lock with relative ease and get some XP for your trouble. So even though your shifty ranger was particularly unlucky, and it may feel like you were cheated from that roll, there are sometimes alternatives or even means of getting a second chance. If the lock breaks again, you can't repair it a second time, but you were given the opportunity to try again, and made another skill relevant, and by extension, potentially another ranger. And you did all this in an in-world way rather than safe scumming. Obviously, this isn't a frequent occurrence. There won't be a ton of checks that give you a second chance outside of these areas, but there will be many instances where more than one skill will be required in a situation, which makes it potentially a lot more hands-on for each teammate. I think one major gripe I have with this mechanic is I don't think In Exile considered that they really shouldn't be doing anything with skill difficulty 10 outside of persuasion checks. Because once you're at 10, that means that even when maxed out, there's a 10% crit fail chance and a 60% success rate. I've even seen objects with a difficulty rating of 12 for some reason. It's very rare, but if it's not one of the 3 skills that is able to remove crit fail rate, what does the game expect me to do other than save scum? Outside of these cases, the point of an equal skill rank versus difficulty is that it is risky and it'll be safer if your character is more experienced. So you may have to invest in having a super intelligent character. Maybe you'll neglect a certain skill for a while or invest less in a weapon stat. That cost assessment isn't present once your skills are maxed out, so skill checks should probably max out around 7 or 8, where the squad can reasonably make risky checks around that range, but are still incentivized and rewarded to max out these skills. But back on giving your squad mates a shared spotlight, the persuasion system does this swimmingly. Persuasion is the only skill where it's a flat check throughout, and I appreciate that. The skills in 2 are split up into 3 paths: kiss ass, smart ass, and hard ass. Kiss ass being persuasion, hard ass being intimidation, and smart ass being a sort of logic and rhetoric. Some people don't like having split persuasion stats and they think it can be redundant. I think it's not only useful for seeing what parts of a persuasive personality you build into, but it's doubly useful in a squad of characters. Think about it. You could have your squad be comprised of a bunch of asocial combat experts, and the squad leader is the least effective of them in combat, but an excellent smooth talker. You could have a guy as dumb as rocks and an alcoholic, but who's able to outsmart people in conversations and a bizarringly sobering wisdom. You could have a negotiator who knows what to say to diffuse situations, but then he needs his far less subtle partner to talk down anyone who won't budge. You could have a variation of that, or what I think most people do, and what's my personal favorite approach, having 3 different people specialize in each persuasion stat. I think this more personalizes your squad as a whole. Without getting too ahead in the realms of UI, whichever ranger is selected at the time of the conversation is the one who speaks in the text boxes. You could switch between rangers when making responses and inquiries, but honestly, there's no real incentive to. But when there's a persuasion check that you meet the requirements of, you'll automatically switch to the character with the highest designated stat in that persuasion check. If you need to intimidate someone to get more information or their cooperation, you can switch from your polite, friendly leader of Team Echo, who really doesn't want to do this, to your grizzled ex-RSM trooper Bad Cop McGee, who really doesn't want this to work. It makes rangers intervene and take control of the conversation for the benefit of the squad, and I love that. But I guess we should go over what I think is more of an issue with the skill system. There is a huge gap in the value of skills. Not as blatant as other games, and obviously not every skill can be equally useful, and as mentioned before, that is part of the charm of getting a grip on the game as a whole. But we're talking about skills that are absolutely essential, and then some that are basically a waste of points. Bartering yields too little of a benefit to be worthwhile, especially if you know what you're doing and have plenty of sources of income early game. Animal handling is a joke, animal companions are useless in combat, and give pretty pointless buffs for the rangers befriending them until they die. There's a couple of quests that need animal handling to resolve them, but all of them are minor errands, and if you go for them, you really don't need to raise the skill that high. It feels kinda strange to explain to newcomers that toaster repair resolves more quests with better rewards than animal handling. I think it's valid to argue that each skill should have a presence in the game, and someone should be able to make a strong case on why they were worth investing in. It's already very difficult for animal handling. I'm not seeing anyone argue you should spend 1/3 of a run's worth of skill points on an average intelligence ranger for that sweet 10% discount. I think this is a good opener to transition to Wasteland 3 skills. Wasteland 3 has 22 skills and 1 secret skill as opposed to the game's 29 with 2 secret skills. They got a lower count because certain skills were cut, others were merged, and perception became its own stat. The first positive quality I could think of when talking about this game's skill system is that no skill is as weak as the ones in Wasteland 2. One could make the argument that you could ditch Animal Whisperer, but it got buffed a ton. Animals were separate followers with huge health pools, decent damage, and relevant bonuses for the rangers that tamed them. Maybe leadership, but those who are familiar with the game's combat will understand why that's a bad idea. Leadership has a much more active approach for your allies this time around. It still gives hit chance to those in leadership range, although at a lower degree, but also gives bonuses to the team on reviving allies, damage bonuses if the leader kills an enemy boss, and crit chance if the leader kills multiple enemies in a turn. I am sad they got rid of the going rogue feature of 2 because I think that depicted character personality through their sense of discipline more, but the things we got in place do encourage a supportive or an aggressive leader, or if you build this just right, both, which I can't help but appreciate. The one skill in the listing I don't much care for is barter. In 2, your bartering sell rate was around 30% of the original value. You could sell it for 40% with maxed out bartering and have a 15% discount, 10% for bartering, and the kiss ass perk Silver Tongue would give you an additional 5%. But in 3, you get these huge selling bonuses because the base selling amount is 5%. So it tries to sound big when the max out is 30% the base value, which is still important, mind you. But my issue is outside the barter perks. The passive bonus isn't trying to make bartering feel strong, but to make it feel mandatory. I do think these changes overall make these previously useless skills much more fun to use, and I have to commend that, though I would brainstorm a bit more on barter. I get that it can't be a high sell rate or you'll have the Fable exploit of being able to buy and resell items for unlimited money, but there's gotta be a happy medium here where bartering is strong, but not strong arming you to get it. Some skills also play a bigger role in dialogue, as there are now skill checks to help shift the conversation to your benefit. And it's not just for the persuasion stats. Whether it be for getting bonus pay for missions or intimidating enemies before a fight to apply a debuff, really nice stuff. My favorite part is that some of the checks lead to a negative result. This isn't sarcasm. The reason I say this is because you shouldn't just mindlessly click on a check just because it's available. The game expects you to consider the consequences of doing so. It expects you to pay attention. But this is where I think things start to go downward, because instead of rolling, everything is a flat check. But not only is everything a flat check, and the instances that require multiple people pitching in to achieve a singular goal is a lot less common. To put it simply, you'll occasionally get scenarios where someone will have to disarm a bomb or maybe some mines at a door before lockpicking it, and there may be a dialogue scenario where there will be multiple options to resolve something, but typically, you need to pick one of those options. It's not uncommon to blitz through a room after clearing an area just to have one guy running around lockpicking everything. I don't feel as much of a sense of unified effort as I do in the second game. Part of it might be because it will just auto-select the person who would pass a check, and that person will run out of your squad and then just resolve it. Sure, it's more convenient than clicking over the specific character or right-clicking and then selecting the check, or using the hotbar key. But it also feels less personable in that way. It also feels a lot more demanding in skills because the difficulty level scales up pretty fast. And part of it's because it requires a lot less skill points to rank up in lower levels. But another part of it is that you cannot fail a skill check. You either meet the requirement or you don't. And so the skill checks are higher to accommodate for that. And the fact that there can be a 9 skill point difference between 2 starting rangers, it lays on hard for some of the early game skill checks. This is why you'll be given a level 6 lockpicking check in areas you're expected to visit around level 5. And so we move on to weapon skills, which is where I think the flaws are going to start becoming even more obvious. You'll notice every weapon category except for brawling and sniper rifles has 2 weapons they give proficiency to. This is where most of the skill merging I mentioned earlier took place. The reason why they have 2 weapons for most skills ends up being pretty simple when you realize that the skills are all built with the same idea in mind. You're expected to pick a small group of skills for each ranger, then max them out. Assuming you're using a skill book for every skill, we'll skip the 10th rank for each point. You can decrease it a bit more by using trinkets and certain armor along with the respec exploit mentioned earlier. But if we're going with that argument, I feel the need to point out that only 5 armor pieces raises a skill, 2 of them raise mechanics, and are in the same slot, and are found in the exact same area. So there's a combination based on background, trinkets, and armor where you can get +3 effects, others get a +2 and a +1, and the rest are either combat skills or lockpicking, which leaves a ton of room for variation depending on the combination of skills. And I need to keep reminding myself for this review, this is not a guide. So for the sake of simplicity, we're going to go over these stats up to rank 9, which is 22 skill points per max skill. So that's 66 skill points. You can get 76 by level 25, including the 1 skill point from having at least 1 intelligence. If you run Poindexter to level 25, you can get somewhere between 88 to 97 skill points, depending on your intelligence score. Minimum, that's enough to max out 4 skills. If you min-max correctly with the books, the intelligence score should give you a little leeway if you mess up in any way. This means for most characters you have 1 combat skill and 2 other skills. You may know where I'm going with this. Considering in the 3rd game there's a total of 6 rangers in a squad, you can max out 2 non-combat skills normally, yet there are 16 non-combat skills. 4 of those rangers will need to max out an extra skill in order to max out all by endgame. It's kind of an open secret, but something you kind of have to overcome if you want to achieve late game effectiveness. Not every skill needs to be maxed out via skill points, and others you can sell with hitting 10 with a trinket. You don't need the level 10 perk for Toaster Repair. The things you can get from rank 10 on Toaster Repair itself is already more important, so trinketing into level 10 is the superior strategy. You honestly can't stop leveling up Barter by 7 and won't suffer from it, and plenty of other examples I haven't listed, but the sooner you learn this, the less hellish this becomes, because the other important lesson is that over half the cost of skills in this game are in the last 3 ranks of a skill. You can't keep a companion at the base whose sole purpose is to max out weapon and armor modding and be dismissed whenever they're done with your gear. Though I feel the fact that you have to do these things to accomplish this effectively further emphasizes the problem. It takes a really elaborate amount of min-maxing that's difficult for even players who know what they're doing to get at, and one can argue that's the skill ceiling, or that gives replay value that you can't optimize every skill. But for the latter, there's simply not enough skills for there to be a wide array of additional playthroughs. You'd be basically switching out 1 skill for each of the first starting rangers. The experience with the game won't noticeably shift from that alone. And for the former, though I can see the appeal of trying to fit all the skills in all together, that line of reasoning hits a wall when accounting for the hard cap being 35. 10 more levels would mean everyone would be able to get 4 skills maxed with only a little bit of optimization. I get it was in Exile's intent to make the game more difficult to maximize builds in Wasteland 3, Hence the Meat Maker update, which drastically increased XP required past level 20, because they wanted to go basically as far as they could without actually decreasing the level cap. My issue is, even if you were getting the levels you needed to get the 4th skill row, that doesn't mean options for optimization go away. In fact, I would argue that being able to reach level 35 reasonably without insane grind, you'd be able to cover all your bases without exploits. So more casual players would be more mindful of that, and respecting the occasional NPC to cover their bases, or people building the roleplay a squad won't have to have any particular issues, while someone more experienced and determined to optimize their squad will be rewarded with extra skill points left over, where they can start putting them in places that early game would be considered redundant, but maybe they want to invest in certain abilities or passive bonuses that certain skills provide. It would still reward build competency, but rather than rewarding them through completion, giving them room to boost rangers that will surely come in handy for higher difficulties. And some of you may be wondering why you simply don't invest as hard in weapons for certain characters, and that's because weapon training is also different here. As mentioned before in Wasteland 2, the first point gives you the weapon's base accuracy. In 3, the higher the weapon's tier, the more points you need in that weapon category to operate it properly. If you're underleveled, you get 10% less hit chance, can't crit, and can't build strike rate using the weapon, making it technically functional, but making it a lot harder to use normally because crits are huge, building strike is a big deal for a lot of weapons, tipping your accuracy by 10% isn't huge, but losing accuracy in general is always annoying, especially if it's offsetting 3 skill ranks worth of accuracy in that skill line. DC buffs apply no matter how many ranks below you are, and this is why so many of the weapon skills provide a second weapon, because there's absolutely no room for deviation and additional weapon categories. This is done to compensate. This really detracts from the weapon variety of Wasteland 2, where you could pair off a ton of weapon categories. You could have a guy trained in every weapon if you really wanted to for some reason, though you wouldn't be particularly good at any of them. In 3, you're locked into whatever weapon category you have, and if you have explosives or weird science, you can get a few additional options, but that's it. Although it has a lot of quality of life changes, 3 is very rigid in design. It makes you commit down these paths rather than dip into some places, overlap in others, and commit where you please. I think to really show off said overlap, it's time to go over perks. Perks are one of the big reasons I would never recommend Wasteland 2's default version over Director's Cut, even if you're missing out on certain portraits or have to safe edit Gary Wolfe in, because the perks add quite a bit to the game. In Wasteland 2, there are 94 perks, which sounds pretty daunting. You may even think that there should be less, and I think you're right, because there's most certainly fillers in this list. Out of the perks, 36 of them are redundant. And when I say redundant, I mean specifically perks that could have easily been one perk, but they were split off into 2 or 3. So if these perks were merged into their final stage and just given a normal perk, they'd be closer to 13, not factoring in a few weapon perks that ape a gimmick from one another, though that's not as big of a deal for me. And although there are plenty of weak perks, I would only argue with confidence that 3 of them are outright useless. So I feel pretty confident in saying I think just shy of 1/3 of Wasteland 2's perks are filler, which is still pretty bad, and even more puzzling when you consider that most of these skills still have a decent amount of perks even without splitting certain ones into multiple, when they're not as strong until you get the final version. It's especially frustrating because you only get a perk point every 4 levels, so you'll be expected to get around 8 or 9 through a thorough standard run, but the rest? Well, that's where the fun begins. Some of these skills have perks that make their weapon gimmicks stand out more, like Brawling's random precision shot status effect chance on hit, which is only matched with machine guns, but they also get to reduce armor by 1 with an additional perk in their kit, while also having more chances to roll said status effect per turn with longer range. So how would Brawling compete with that? Well, Brawling only requires 1 perk point, and if your Brawling Ranger is also trained to brute force, you can pick up a strange little perk line from that skill that also applies a chance for enemies to be stunned on hit. Now you're getting the chance of applying multiple status effects just for hitting the enemy, and you can top it all off late game with upchuckers, which admittedly fall off near the end of the game, but they also give a high chance to cause vomiting, a status effect that butchers organic enemy combat initiative. I need a second to gush over this, because in this example, you're incentivized to take a non-combat skill on a character that you would typically build strength and speed for, and that skill's brute force, something that works a lot better in character for someone with high strength. Normally, it wouldn't matter who takes that skill, because a 10 intelligence nerd can kick down a wall just as well as a 10 strength piece of a man, so long as they have the same skill rank. But here, there is a genuine incentive to build it on a melee character because they can benefit from the potential perks. This also shows that there's an overlap in defensive and utility perks on combat skills, as well as offensive perks on skills that aren't offensive, which encourages certain combinations. Some are relatively obvious once you learn the ropes. You'll always have your lockpicker also safe crack because they only have 1 perk, which is really useful for offsetting the game's poor skill check scaling late game, but you can only get it if said ranger has mastered both skills. And admittedly, there are some perks that are so insanely strong they're taken by everyone, and there may be a skill perk or 2 that give a power spike while requiring no real commitment, but there are so many perks that can really help personalize builds because some perks perks provide things that end up being insanely useful when paired up with other playstyles, and in some ways you may not expect. There's a lot of room for experimentation with this system, and I really do appreciate. I concede you're never gonna get anything as wacky and character building as other games. If this is your bread and butter, you probably already play Underrail whenever you escape the psych ward, but it's these things that I think really make you think further on how to play and build every squad mate. In Wasteland 3, there's quite a few less perks you gain through levels. Around 80 perks this time around are required normally. However, this time, they're all unique. There are only a few stat sticks and journalist perks, and there are a few secret perks that really aren't worth bothering with except for one. These perks are a lot more useful across the board, but there's noticeably less perks in certain skills than others. I know 2 has a pair of skills sharing a single perk, but this is far more egregious. Weapon skills that have 2 weapons give a choice of 7 perks, with the exception of big guns which gets 6, while brawling and sniper rifles get 4 perks for being singular. These perks offer gimmicks and a lot of them serve as new abilities for the designated weapon, and there are abilities available in certain non-combat skills, which the intent seems to be designing these rangers as pseudo-classes. The abilities often have major secondary bonuses which encourage a sense of synergy. And then there's the additional 40 perks that are non-combat skills. We're going to call them non-combat even though the explosives and weird science give you training in certain weapons. Not bad, 16 skills, 40 perks. That's a 2.5 average ratio. But then you realize it could take anywhere between 6 perks to 0. You heard me right, explosives have 6 perks, while lockpicking, kiss ass, and hard ass have 0, and armor modding has 1. In 3, rangers can get a perk every 2 levels past 4, so you're expected to get around 11 to 12 perks through the game. It's worth noting that you have 5 generic perks available for everyone, but if I were to, say, make a ranger who's a sniper, trained in lockpicking, and I decide to give him hard ass, I will only have a total of 9 perks I can invest into this character. Forget not feeling like you get to choose on the list of perks, you may simply run out of places to put the perk points in if you're not careful. Whenever I take up all the generalist perks in the game, it's not because I feel like they're appropriate for my ranger. I'm taking these because I don't have any other choice. It's not like I'm actually excited for 35 more health, 5% evasion, 2 more armor. Wasteland 2 has a longer list of generalist perks, some that were universally useful, but others that were more situational and leaned a little more into assisting a specialized playstyle. What happened to Limber? I think perks even more exacerbated the feeling of restraint the third game's skill system carries, and maybe I can emphasize this a bit more when I start going over quirks. For those not familiar, quirks are Wasteland 2 and 3's equivalent of traits from Fallout. They're things unique to the character that work as a double-edged sword that really emphasize a playstyle during character creation. There's nothing really stopping you from having multiple rangers with the same quirk, but it serves well to give the squad a bit more personality or complement a build. There's a lot of bizarre effects in Wasteland 2 when it comes to quirks, from allowing the player to dodge crits at the cost of being pushed back in the combat order, healing more effectively but you can't heal yourself, to lightning randomly striking units in combat. I think this hits a happy medium between giving the players strong strategies to coincide with their builds, as well as your approach in the game. Having an asshole means you never have to invest in any persuasion skill, but can only use hard ass unless you later get a companion that invests in the other 2. Having a misophobic character means you need to have 2 people trained in medicine, and plenty of other things that can either be major combat benefits, or go so far as have you rethink how you approach your ranger's creation. What I'm saying is, making one of my rangers an alcoholic had more lasting effects on how I approached the run than I thought it would. The distillery went from a place I don't even put a second thought into to the top priority location of interest. In Wasteland 3, much like the rest of the game, it has more of a shift towards the combat. I'd be hard pressed to say they're not as good as 2's quirks, but I do like 2's drawbacks conditions more, as these seem to be more focused on being stat swaps for combat than 2's special conditions that derive more of a personality, like a ranger being sort of unreliable due to being bipolar, or a ranger refusing to wear fresh shoes that'll make them faster because she's a monk. One thing that really shows the difference between 2 and 3's quirks is delayed gratification is a really good quirk as it gives a stronger power spike before you even hit the second half of the game, at the cost of a weaker early game. I'd argue it might be too good because the drawback isn't all that noticeable if on a 10 intelligence ranger, but because of how expensive skills are in 2, delayed gratification still isn't as effective as an additional stage of intelligence scaling. It's a risk for people unfamiliar with the game and don't know how far it'll go, but it comes with the assumption that the levels go far enough to pay off, and that assumption is correct, making it a valuable option for new players and veterans alike. While Poindexter is incredibly risky for non-seasoned players, this is a quirk with intense drawbacks that the only benefit is around 11 to 12 skill points. But if you hyper grind to the end game, you can get up to 17. So the playthroughs that stop around the point you've burnt through most of the content ends up still not giving you enough skill points to max out an additional skill unless you optimize to a meticulous degree, though this oddly makes it a very powerful early game option because skills in 3 are a lot cheaper at the starting levels and the health gap is smaller. But again, it's focused on combat setback, as there's a heavier emphasis on combat in 3. I was not expecting the quirk section to be as short as it was. I think it's very much a preferential thing. As a weird and sweaty nerd, I suppose I really appreciate 2's quirks giving you a role-playing purpose for the squad mates with bizarre mechanics. You may have to account for them when strategizing, and a few simpler ones to throw in for good measure. While in 3, a lot of quirks are no nonsense and more direct in their intent. Even the joke ones have practical application that allows you to undo the joke aspect. Maybe I'm more excited to get the backgrounds, which might be confusing to some, but I find it important to cover because it captures a bit of what I was talking about earlier when covering skills, so we're gonna go ahead and do just that. For Wasteland 2, it's very simple. The background is an empty space. It's a text box for you to fill a backstory for your ranger. Pre-made rangers have backstories of their own, and so do companions, which some companion backstories do end up being relevant in pocket moments. In Wasteland 3, the backgrounds are an additional form of bonus. Some give a bit of backstory, others just a bit of personality prompt. Like player character backstories in 2, they have no real consequences in the game. With 2 exceptions, one being the goat killer background that causes a demonic goat to be put into the random counter on table later on to avenge a ranger's dead mother. The second being that these pre-made backgrounds provide a small bonus to pick and choose from. There's a lot more incentive to pick a background based on stats, because it complements an intended build than it is for a character archetype you're going for. I honestly much prefer 2's approach. People would argue 2 is providing nothing. It's a glorified text file that you can spew your character's fanfic into, along with a few multiple choice answers and an age bar of info to fill out for your character, which, funny enough, the only consequence here is if you smoke a certain brand of cigarettes. But this is the type of stuff that makes me feel like Wasteland 2 wants you to become more immersed. The more you know about the setting, the easier it is to tie together character lore with the events in the game. The more you can have characters coincide with other factions, develop motivations for joining the Rangers in the first place. Sure, it makes no tangible change in the game, but encourages the player to get into a mindset where they aren't just making builds, these are people. And even if what happens in their backstory doesn't ultimately matter, they can use that as a springboard in how they approach doing things that they do. In 3, players will give someone a background of disloyal, bomb-lobbing maniac who's also a serial killer for the sole reason that it gives a lot of extra explosive damage for your build and gives you free AP on killing somebody. But now that that's covered, that's everything essential for building a character in both games and how they differ. I think now is a good time to actually start going over the gameplay. There's a huge difference between the focuses of 2 and 3 when it comes to gameplay and narrative. We see both, especially in their introductions, but we'll focus more on the gameplay aspect here. Wasteland 2 is a bit more relaxed at first, but also quick to put the player in control. It shows off its interaction system, how persuasion works, the navigation map, and then sends you on your merry way. Wasteland 3 prefers to get you into the action quick. It keeps it narrow for a while. You're immediately put in an ambush site and going over the basics of combat as you fight your way through. You're introduced to skill checks and speech checks before making your way to the ambush site, while Wasteland 2 prefers to get you to learn how to interact with objects, explore, and then let you go over combat in a more thorough detail shortly after the next major part of the story. Here's an example. You can get a fairly strong early game companion, Angel of Death, if you explore around, and some loot if you dig up some piles of dirt, but wait, how can you do that? You don't have a shovel. The funeral serves not only as an important narrative piece for your relatively green squad's call to action, but also reminds you that there was a shovel back at the grave. Taking it means that you have a means to dig holes in hidden treasure spots. It also can teach you rather quickly the consequences of digging in places you really shouldn't. So back to business. To dig, you need to select the shovel and click on things you want to dig up. Surely there's a faster way to deal with this. You may notice the hotbar has your skills automatically assigned. Way too many to just be for skills. The shovel is one of the most commonly used items in a ranger's inventory for whoever's designated to carry it. It encourages early on for you to utilize your game's hotkey bar. A very good habit to have in this game, as it's one of the most interactive isometric RPGs I've played. It feels very true to old school Fallout in that way, with the quality of life changes of showing you what items can be expected to be used and add to your hotkey. Meanwhile in 3, they make it clear that there's too many raiders for you to fight, they have the advantage of knowing the land, and you're completely scattered. So it encourages a stealthy combat approach, messing with security systems and destroying a mech to sneak past it, and gunning down a distracted psycho, or, as mentioned earlier, gaining an advantage in positioning against foes that outnumber you. It teaches you hazardous materials and explosive barrels, and you notice that there's a lot of consumable items available to you. Medpacks, a self-healing called Med Hypo that requires no field medic training. Before you even leave the ambush site, you'll find yourself with not enough slots to utilize everything on your character. This was likely to make up for consumables and throwables being a lot stronger in this game, and that the squad now shares an inventory as opposed to the second game's individual-based inventory where you had to share items and distribute carefully for weight management. It's less of a hotkey bar and more of a combat item bar, hence why it's balanced on how many of these items that you can use at any given time. Whatever objects you need to solve puzzles for or interact with anybody will simply open up in a dialog box, where the relevant item will be used as long as it's in your inventory. The much more limited quick slot space means you have to pick and choose between which combat items your squad mates protagonists can use. Having characters with corresponding skills allowed them to use a lot of consumables with specific requirements, which means you have to juggle which ones will be useful with who in combat. This does bring prep work and cost assessment into the game, which I think is supposed to compensate for the loss of ammo management and storage space that the second game provided. Those to a pretty limited degree here in my opinion. I found characters with a lot more supportive skills would be using the consumables more often, and all I needed to worry about was a more aggressive character with a fistful of med hypo in one hand, and whatever buffing drug I needed in the other. And then in late game, investing more in smoke grenades because evasion is a king stat in 3. You can get your evasion very high in the game even without cover. There's a new mechanic for burning leftover AP at the end of a ranger's turn. The original is where you set yourself to ambush, where so long as you have enough AP for an attack, you'd attack the first enemy to come within your range, or to move inside your range. Then there's Prepare, which transfers 3 AP to the next phase at the cost of 1. In the second game, you could only store up to 1 AP. But then there's also Defend, which automatically ends the ranger's turn, and for each AP left, it gives them plus 5 evasion. Smoke grenades on top for plus 25%, and if your ranger defends with 3 AP left, rangers with high speed now have more evasion than normal allies behind cover in every angle. And this didn't even include taking drugs. This is also not including lucky evades, which are completely different sources of evasion that make you have a chance of evading attack when they roll the hit. Though when I think about it, having a high evasion means less chances to roll a lucky evade, but it's more of a contingency than anything else. The reason I bring all of this up is because enemies do a lot of damage. To the point where early game has some particularly difficult fights, they don't need to land many hits to drop a moderate health ranger because they have so many attacks and because of how armor works in this game. In Wasteland 3, armor is calculated against penetration. In the percentage armor versus penetration math, if the penetration is less than the armor, you take damage based on how much the weapon's penetration makes up the armor percentage-wise, but you will take a maximum of 80% damage. So hitting an enemy with 50 armor with a weapon that has 10 penetration will have them deal 20% damage, but if you hit the same enemy with 49 penetration, you'll deal 80%. If the penetration beats the armor, you deal full damage. Having more penetration than they do have armor doesn't do extra damage. The purpose of the 80% gap is to make sure that the armor still has a form of relevance when the penetration doesn't break through, but as mentioned earlier, the enemies still do quite a bit of damage and have several attacks. Here's an endgame enemy attacking a ranger at full health with 42 armor. It's not amazing, but it's in the higher end of light armor ratings, and still much higher than they've got, and you can tell as this enemy runs up to my ranger and hits, and it's reduced by 38%. So I guess his penetration's around, what, 26? Yet the first hit took nearly half my ranger's health. He used Bleeding Strike, which can apply bleeding and doubles the weapon damage on use. But he hits again with the normal attack and it takes another big chunk of health. And he hits a third time, this time critting and takes another huge chunk. So naturally the fourth attack drops my ranger. This was really hard to track without combat log, but I managed. My ranger had 225 health endgame, so you could tell he was a squishy 4 strength ranger. And admittedly, if those were normal non-crit attacks, he would have just barely lasted through it. But that there was a bleeding strike pretty much meant that all he had to do was get 3 attacks and roll well. And can we go back to the fact that the enemy was a low-level henchman in this fight, yet he proceeded to move a space, use bleeding strike, and 3 more attacks? With a blade melee, that's a process that takes 14 AP for a player to pull off, and he did it without anything to boost his AP. This is on normal difficulty. One could argue I should have just optimized my armor more, and maybe I should have, but even if I did, it would have only stopped me from getting mopped by the first enemy, because as penetration gets higher, your armor gap has to increase to be more effective. And since you need increasing strength, and by extension, high scaling health to wear heavy armor, you get a lot more effective health with it, along with stronger healing, since healing in 3 is based off of max health. So with the exception of 1 set of light armor you can get in the game, there's no point in building survivability if you're not a melee ranger. You might as well build your attributes for evasion, more damage, and get more armor mods for the same thing. And then, I don't know, pick up the DLC which gives the best light armor in the game. So the ultimatum feels blatant, tanky melee and glass cannon ranged. And at the end of the day, you're both still glass cannons. You can last longer with higher armor, but you're still very much mortal. They have too much raw damage and too many attacks. The strength is mostly there to make your melee build stronger, and if you're using melee, you're going to build speed, so you're going to have a good evasion anyway. The real strategy in 3 is to stack as much damage as you can, and then get as many kills possible in the first couple of turns. I'm not kidding, some of the more infamous fights in this game tend to have your team wiped in the first couple of turns, so your goal is to kill enough of them to get your foot in the door, which can be pretty tough. It requires a lot of working out the multipliers and synergizing certain abilities, and I say this because the enemies are insanely spongy. Not to forget the fact that enemies scale with your level as well, raising their health and damage in the process. For anyone who's played Wasteland 3, they may have noticed how pitifully weak assault rifles have become. Then you get an elemental one or give it an elemental mod, and suddenly it's keeping up again. Elementals are so insanely powerful it's pretty much impossible to ignore. They get plus 99 penetration, they're designed to ignore armor. There are enemies that are resistant to certain elements, and some even immune. But so long as you're carrying 2 different elemental weapons or just explosives, you'll be fine. But it's not just because they ignore armor. armor. Overcoming armor in the grand scheme of things isn't that important when the enemy has thousands of health versus your rifle that deals 40 in a 3-round burst. They're also stronger because they deal increased damage based on enemy matchup, and every form of damage increase that affects normal weapons also affects elemental weapons, while elemental weapons also have sources that increase their damage output. They're just better in every way. You can get so many modifiers on an elemental weapon that an identical non-elemental weapon will deal less damage to an enemy resistant to the elemental one. This only further emphasizes the grand strategy, lots and lots of stacked damage. AoE if you can get it too. In Wasteland 2, damage is important, but most stacking sources aren't nearly as effective, and you also have to focus on resources and especially assessing your enemies. If you're being attacked by wild animals, you want to lean away from melee if you can focus on leg shots. Enemies have annoying effects in melee that aren't just damage. Toads steal weapons, wolves proc bleed, lizards bring disease, and these things take a lot of health away over a long period of time, requiring a specific medical item to treat both respectively and somebody trained in it that you may or may not have a surplus of. And 3, Medipacks heal over time as well as a chunk of health, so they do a lot of wonders counteracting bleeding and poison effects out of combat, even though poison is supposed to counter healing. In 2, you only have so many health kits, and you have to burn a ton more to keep someone stable compared to using a suture kit. You have areas that open up with skill checks and careful positioning that makes fights substantially easier. 3 also has this, but it's mostly side paths at the start of dungeons and arenas that you can open up with perception checks. 2 also focuses on being mindful of ammo counts, reloading your weapons after fight, and modifying them so they're less likely to jam, which is a far bigger deal to early game weapon modding than a +4 crit chance will ever be. You'll want to remember to unjam your gun if it does jam, then reload, or else you'll have a gun that doesn't have full ammo in the next fight. It's simple micromanagement, but it's also gratifying once you get the process down. Energy weapons in 2 are considered a complete joke, but I'll gladly go up the bat for them because I think they're an amazing secondary after playing through the game at least once. When you know where the robots and the heavily armored enemies are, you now have an immediate melting array that doesn't require a ton of commitment. If I were to describe the dichotomy between these two games, which might sound weird to people who've played both, but I'd call Wasteland 2 the easier game but more punishing, and Wasteland 3 the more difficult game but more approachable. 2 is part of the trust me bro, it gets really good when you spend a dozen hours learning how to play it starter kit, but I assure you that is the case. Meanwhile 3 was made much more with console in mind, for better and for worse. Sure, it was on console too, but I think being purchased by Microsoft greatly affected their approach and gave a heavier focus on simplistic entry level for more new people and a more casual audience, while trying to maintain that engagement through difficulty in overcoming harder combat encounters, which is why difficulty scales so insanely high. And for what it's worth, it does do what it intends to in presentation and team-wide initiative. Things are a lot flashier, consumables are more relevant, the combat feels a lot smoother thanks to you being able to move or control multiple characters in between their animations. The enemy AI also do this to a more natural degree, so you have segments where multiple enemies will be operating their turns at the same time, which accelerates turns in a seamless way when the game is just simple enough to get away with multiple units operating without things getting confusing. The only issue is that sometimes the camera will wildly pan between multiple characters taking turns trying to show their actions, which is just disorienting on bigger maps. Overall though, this allows the game to move along faster without an accelerate function, so even though I don't really like team-wide initiative, I'm glad the game's taking measures to utilize the benefits of it. I won't beat around the bush, Wasteland 2's combat system can be pretty boring, especially in comparison of 3, and God help anyone who plays Standard Edition, but at least in my eyes, it goes from bearable to fun because there is a variety through unique weapons, stats effects, build management, skill ceiling, and enemy assessment, along with learning when and where to take precision shots to turn the tide of a battle. The Definitive Edition gave enough quality of life changes that gives the game a level of depth, which I certainly find a novelty in what is already an excellent formula that just needed some tuning. Okay, for an example of how awesome Wasteland 2's combat can actually be, the bleed out system. Wasteland 3's bleed out system kinda works like strikes. You get downed, you have 4 turns to revive your ally. When you do, they develop an injury that gives a randomized debuff. The universal thing among them is that the bleed out timer will go down by 1 turn each time they get one of these debuffs. So each time they go down without getting treated with a surgical kit, the shorter their bleed out timer is. If their bleed out timer hits 0 in battle, they become incapacitated. They can only be revived through ultramorphine or treatment with a doctor, then they'll become available again. If you have permadeath active, leaving you with having to replace them. And it's actually the recruitable NPCs that end up getting the heavier blow when you lose them. You have a small pool of potential recruits, some of which loyalty hinges on your decisions in the major plot. In Wasteland 2, it's kind of the opposite in that regard. It's bad to lose a recruit, especially one with a good attribute line that you've been training to have a skill set that plays off your squads, but there's plenty of potential replacements of varying quality. If you lose a ranger, you lose a much more handcrafted member, one who's far less replaceable. All character creation concludes when the game begins. Anyone you get from here is pre-made, which adds a heavier level of tension. You really can't afford to lose these guys, especially later on. A bleed out system that can cause these deaths is a lot more complex as well. Instead of dropping to 0, you get a negative HP counter. If it's less than 25% of your max health, you go into unconscious, which is stable and allows the player to slowly recover and gain consciousness. You'll get back up with no ill side effects. When below 25%, you become seriously wounded. You slowly lose health and conditions will worsen if left alone. When revived, you'll have a heavy debuff on the revived character. At 75% negative HP or below, the player is now comatose, which is the same condition and effect, except when revived, you have -2 to all attributes for a set time. When the negative HP reaches your max HP or greater, the ranger dies. I adore this system because it makes characters with higher health pools last much longer in the bleed out, while still not making them ridiculously strong. Being low health in Wasteland 2 is a genuine gamble. You may want to stay low health so you don't have to burn healing resources and hold out for a field promotion to regain all your health for free, but that comes with risks. There isn't much in this game that can instantly kill a ranger, but being out in the open with low health against an automatic weapon is a really quick and easy way to go down. Not respecting the lines of fire of your squad mates can have a critical sniper round going through the head of an especially unlucky ranger. Going down is a huge deal in this game because of the severity, the consequences. If your squad leader goes down, everything goes to hell. You lose the accuracy bonuses from leadership, and if you have a specially ratted group, they will absolutely go rogue. And although this means there's no limit to how many times an ally can be brought back in an encounter, it's wildly risky. To revive an ally in 3 requires to be next to them and to spend 3 AP. If you have a certain field medic perk, you can remove their bleed out effects and replace it with positive ones, pretty much undoing any damage and actually making it a benefit. I kid you not, since there are perks and quirks that benefit from squad mates going down, you may have a martyr on your team. When I was playing co-op with a friend, he was constantly running out with the leadership rally and the support foam finger to give a ton of bonuses. He'd then go down, I would go up and revive him with a high chance of counteracting any negative effects, or resetting all of his cooldowns so he could do it again. In 2, you need not only the AP, you need the character to be trained in surgeon to have a surgical kit, and you end the character's turn treating the patient. Your character is completely vulnerable during the process, which means the more lethal the injury, the less time you have, and the less luxury you have of playing it safe. If you're not careful, you could have 2 bodies on your hands. Hearing that bleed out sound effect becomes all the more stressful, and if your enemies have explosives, you feel even more incentivized to clear those out because the AoE damage will shorten the time even more. Bleeding and poisoning effects will become far more deadly because if an ally goes down with those effects, it greatly accelerates the death timer, making red scorpion gunners and wild animals fairly easy enemies you can work around with and not have an issue if you take them seriously, but also highly lethal if you don't. I don't think I've had an instance of Wasteland 2 where a ranger had ended up dying and I don't feel responsible for it. But in regards to the field promotions I mentioned earlier, those are the game's way of leveling up. Even this has more steps than Wasteland 2, which some people will find as more of a hassle, especially compared to 3's automatic level up, allowing you to go to your character screen and allocate your points. But others may see this as another form of the game trying to get you more engaged with the world. I certainly do. To level up, the game has you report on your radio. The squad is reporting their activity to HQ to earn their field promotions. As mentioned earlier, these promotions fully heal the promoted and automatically promotes everyone who's eligible for level up, making it worth timing to save resources. But also adds this layer of Team Echo keeping Ranger HQ in the know, which I think complements the Ranger aesthetic. Rangers are so hyper fixated on the radio towers and their channels because Ranger life requires a lot of patrols. They need to be out there to look out for people in the cruel radiated desert of Arizona. It makes you feel more like a cog in a machine, especially when you hear other teams giving out status reports on missions.
Baker 1 to Citadel Base.
Baker 1, you're back. Everything all right? Did you take Esteban Negro?
Yep, no problem. Bought him drinks till he fell over.
Good job. Any casualties?
Well, we're all fine now, but
But what?
tomorrow morning's gonna be a bitch.
The overworld can seem pretty stale, especially early on. It's what you would expect of the Arizona desert, to be fair, but it is something 3 has a leg up over in this regard. Snow plows aside as you ride around in your truck with your squad. You can knock down barricades, hit gear, discover hidden bunkers all visible in the overworld, and the truck gets faster with more upgrades, which perfectly ties to the map effectively growing as more of the areas open up to you as you get more radiation shielding, making it less of a hassle to go from place to place. Though I do have my gripes with the vehicle system, some I will save for lore segments, but for now, I wish there was more visual customization, and I also prefer the early development vehicles where they were more like a buggy. They had to use in car doors as cover, and someone had to man the turret manually to fire it, rather than the glorified 7th party member it ends up being in an outdoors area. Also, I wish we heard some Ranger radio chatter rather than exclusively the radios of some factions, and random Wastelanders shenanigans and a small looping pool of audio logs. The second game had that. Occasionally, you'd get reports from channels to Vargas from other squads out in the wastes, telling you that they may not be with you, but they are being productive in the setting, and they are putting up with the same crap you are. It makes it feel more reasonable and that they're doing so much while people are at base. A lot of them are there to maintain Ranger HQ and make the patrols go smoothly. After all, helping them helps you get a lot of extra gear and XP. Take for example the Citadel's cartographer Thrasher, a retired hero of the Desert Rangers, or Mer Captain, who is a tech expert who also works with experimental weaponry, which she'll give to you for rare special devices. And if you have things from the old world that don't catch your interest, you can always give them the Corporal Eagleston for maintaining the history of AZ and for the Rangers. They chime in with their own takes in your missions and your decisions. Some give you a good sum of scrap for things other vendors wouldn't bat an eye for, and they all have good reasons for asking for these things to better maintain their base. There's so much here that makes this place feel alive. When I come back to 3 after this feeling, I'm not feeling that spark. I only really feel any conversation with Gideon. Everyone seems to comment on the refugees, and he can ask if you about the loyalty of the crew, but that's about it. All of it's a fleeting memory, and although certain decisions allow for other people to arrive at your base and for certain events to occur, I just end up looking back at that one ranger at the chicken coop. People are dying, why are you even here? I'm not sure where to put this part, though it is important, so while we're on characters, a quick aside is the companion system. In 3, there are 8 potential companions, with 2 at any given time compared to the second game's 15, and 3 available at any given time. Some may attribute this to a quantity versus quality type of trade-off, and I couldn't disagree more. Sorry, but Wasteland 3's cast is nowhere near as good as the second game's, and inXile seems to agree because 2 only had a single Wasteland 1 character as a temporary companion, while 3 has 2. That's 1/4 the cast being from the second game, despite the fact that it's an entirely different location with a new squad. And sure, Weston has plenty of potential character development you could build off of, but other than her, everyone is a static character, and honestly, I think static characters fit better for this game, but they're also better personalized in 2. They have tons of comments they make on certain situations or locations or on different people, and they have special interactions and conditions that can be met traveling throughout the area that you would not even suspect to happen. There are 2 takes worth of voice lines on Vulture's cry solely because she has 2 different personalities based on one of your interactions. Is it because she has split personalities or because her moral compass shifts based on your response? No, it's because you can catch her breaking character if you question her long enough before recruitment. Then she reveals she tries to act like a clever elder to scam non-natives who don't know better. That moment alone determines whether she keeps up the wise savage facade she keeps talking about, or makes observations completely unfiltered.
There are many things that we require. Pig-faced little punks. They all need a serious spanking. Crap. Did I say that out loud? Oh, hell. So much for the Noble Savage Act.
I love this game. One more before we move on, compare Scotchmo from 2 to 3. In 3, Scotchmo is a bizarre supernatural being that knows that you're the squad from the previous game even though you're playing different characters in lore. He's a comic relief character that seems to be just about everywhere there's a bar, even when you don't recruit him. In Wasteland 2, you recruit him in the Rail Nomads camp, often a little hobo settlement. Still seems silly, but out of these identical hobos, you make a perception check on Scotchmo that betrays a level of competence in him. He carries the gun like somebody who knows how to use it. And when you recruit him, he has a quirk where he constantly steals squeezins from the party members who has them. Annoying, but funny if you don't already have an alcoholic on your team. But each party member has a unique item exclusive to them. What's Scotchmo's? Is it his favorite squeezin bottle? A lucky flask? Maybe a joke junk item? No. It's a ring. His wedding ring. A reminder that Scotchmo was a stable, collected person before he became the parody he is now. That no matter how much he drinks, and even though he's forgotten his name and the name of his beloved, he can never truly forget what he lost. That's another thing about Wasteland 2 I admire. These brief, sobering moments in the apocalypse that reminds you of better times, and the importance of pressing forward. But if I'm going to already get so drawn into the world and the aesthetic, I find it apt to go over the visuals, the audio, the miscellaneous stuff that I think will be very much worth going over this time around before tackling the story, and to more easily sink into it. Wasteland 2's customization is very bland when it comes to the player models. You get height, skin color, a slight array of armor, hats, pants, and hair. A lot of character models look kind of samey without different outfits, though you can find unique outfits throughout the game and make your rangers more distinct from one another. A lot of them are stuff that's been worn by other people at some point in the game. Your companions in Wasteland 2 can vary to kind of resembling their portraits to not even remotely. The portraits do a lot of heavy lifting in this game, hence why they come up in the character's overworld dialogue even when not speaking to them, which I'm not against, but after a while you kind of realize how many portraits they have that have been reused, and some have just slight variations of of previous ones. It starts feeling silly when you see Gary, Pistol Pete, and Woodson in the same conversation. Wasteland 3's customization is an entirely different league. They also have outfits that they can access later in the game, but you can switch through an entire wardrobe of clothing you have unlocked at your base, as well as character creation. The armor can be bulky, pointed, sleek. It can be light, modern, angular, absurd. The game has a vanity system that lets you pick between wearing armor the characters have equipped and wearing armor that you think looks cool, or even just settling for default outfits. And you can do this for the head, upper body, and lower body. You also are able to color code the armor, making it better match squad or personal ranger color schemes. You will not be found wanting if you're an armor boy in Wasteland 3. Body types are much more varied. They no longer force people using Circus Freak to wear the clown outfit, which is a shame, but it also means that the players also have clown customization. It's pretty much everything short of body stylers and what I would want for character customization. My only complaints are the face paint is part of the faces themselves, so you can't really select a face and then have specific face paint and scars for a certain character, which I think is pretty annoying. And whenever a character wears a hat, they turn bald. The portraits, on the other hand, are kind of lackluster. It's not that they look bad, but they're all headshot images with bright backgrounds, with a gradient color darkening on the edges. They do have different head angles and some varying expressions, and there are some that I think fit lore-wise, with militaristic or Native American aesthetics, and maybe both. For those who haven't played Wasteland 2, we're not going in the spoiler section yet, but for now, let's just say, canonically, there's a nomadic faction that is probably their best source of recruitment between 2 and 3, but then a lot of them lack anything to show any form of grungy post-apocalyptic aesthetic. I could probably get away with using a few of these for a cyberpunk game. 2's portraits are half-body and often more expressive. They clearly didn't have enough portraits for most of the important characters in the game, so they do have reused portraits and asset flips, as mentioned before. Not to mention the quality of the character and backgrounds can vary from image to image, but they don't look quite as clean. And we get to see more of their clothing, the loose threads, the dusty filters, odd trinkets strapped to their chests, murderous intent, or martyrous intent, how some things in our world take up a whole different meaning in theirs. It makes it a real shame that some of them just seem to be missing, at least in Definitive Edition. The reason for 3 to take the approach it did with portraits is pretty straightforward. Why go through all the effort of making a portrait half-body and giving a vague rundown background when said portraits aren't going to be used for most of the game? So I'm not sure if this is an elephant in the room or just a pet peeve of mine, but the dialogue UI in 3 is horrible. It looks only slightly better than the gameplay reveal placeholder. There's no archive that keeps track of your previous dialogue, so you can't read back to make sure you're following the conversation properly or reread something you misread. The design discourages a frequent use of narration for the character's expressions and dialogue, and it doesn't catch that charm the Wasteland 2 UI has. Look at this thing, it's gorgeous. Oh, hang on. The compass that lazily lingers on a location your camera points and then swings with delay as you rotate. The smudged metal of your hotkey bar with the parts faded by the oil of fingerprints. The exposed wiring that looks like this device had a case on it that's now long gone. The descriptions are written out on what seems to be an old military printer with a constant whizzing as if it's hastily writing the text for narration. The paper being clean enough to read clearly, but worn around the edges, probably a result of the accumulated grime within the machine. Your radio is on the top right of your screen, always flickering in a pattern, not showing its frequency until you activate it, and that's in this bright green digital font. And while trying to avoid spoilers, that frequency changes based on the location you're contacting. Your equipment reflects perfectly what the Rangers tried to be, a bunch of old hand-me-downs of a bygone era, only now being maintained by an obsessive passion to hold tight to some form of civility. We even see this in the main menu screens. Wasteland 3 is a lot sleeker and better looking with its animated screen with a menacing giant Scorpatron, but it looks a lot more generic in its overlay and audio. And 2, the menu is still. You're introduced to the static of a radio signal. When you hover over the options, certain audio files activate, having the radio briefly play parts of a menacing transmission out there. Only when you press new game does this machine move. It's clumsy, definitely layers moving around on a still background, and you can pretty easily tell the Scorpatron itself is a JPEG dropped in, but it does a great job in setting a tone of a still environment, where there's still a danger, and when you take action it drops all pretenses of inactivity. My skin sometimes crawls when I try to load a save and I hear the voice go, synthetic, in a tone so out of place in context that sounds like it's ripped directly out of an infomercial, and only gives a heavier sense of dread and mystery when you know just how much weight that word holds here. Much like its menu screen, 3's UI's darken squares and symbols for abilities. Nothing in here looks like it would belong in the world itself and is here exclusively for the player to navigate it. It feels like it's only trying to do what it needs to in this category. Don't get me wrong, the game's pretty, and it has had details placed in plenty of areas. Have you noticed how combat initiates and ends? The grid layout unraveling over the map as you begin a fight, and then when the combat's over, it spirals and recedes into the token of whichever ranger is selected at the time? Amazing. But because it cut out the dialogue boxes, and it doesn't have any character shown as directing the conversation unless a companion comments, in which case the game pans over to them, it makes the game feel like you're playing a bunch of people who are all just one guy, and a couple of recruits you brought along that chime in on occasions. Only when certain skill checks are done so a ranger approaches and does something in a conversation do I feel a sense of recognition of who in my squad is doing what at any given time. It makes your squad feel more faceless and detracts from the experience. I'm wondering if a big part of this had to do with the first person conversations you have with key characters, which are akin to the talking head moments in Fallout, much more expressive and animated than other interactions with characters, and this is where I think Wasteland 3's presentation and dialogue truly shines. 2's cutscenes are honestly kind of pathetic. There was only one that stuck out in my memory as being cool, and the rest came off as awkward and a little clumsy. But there's a point where one cutscene's visuals in the finale make the entire scene feel goofy before the super menacing payoff, which was obviously not the intention. Now, compare that to Jared Dorsey, who moves in this faux hospitality after murdering most, if not all, of your friends. The glee and anticipation he has at gutting you with his dirty knife as he wears the bones and entrails of his victims. And you can even hear the clinking of bones against his armor as he moves.
I guess you don't know your scripture. The Dorseys are the harbingers of the deluge, the motherfucking end of the old world, and the beginning of the new.
It's honestly impressive, and not the only time the presentation really sells an encounter.
All right. Light him up.
Because these scenes are so scarce, they took time and care animating each and every one with its own body language and posture, which I think helps make it stand out from other fully voiced and animated RPGs that reuse a lot of animations because it's impractical to expect them to have a unique animation for everyone involved. There are segments where they lack this where they very obviously should have had it, like a super important character in the first act, or any of the characters in the DLC, but what they've provided I think was a great example of presentation, and how less can be more.
Looks like a sausage fest to me. Good thing we like sausages.
Did these account for the fact that we're all men?
All the voice acting in Wasteland 3 is competent. I've only had a character speak where I was wondering what the hell she was directed to do when she was putting on a voice, but outside of some deliveries I don't like, all of it seems relatively fine.
Tourmaline called it preemptively defending ourselves. All humans want to kill synths, so we've got to kill them first. It's a matter of survival. I don't want to be turned off.
It is good to have nothing sounding so bizarre in an experience that breaks the immersion. Wasteland 2 had very mixed results on this.
Your names, now!
What? Only Carson survived? The rest are dead? Oh, fuck.
But certainly wasn't without its high points as well.
And I was hoping today was gonna be one big family reunion. Now it's a fucking funeral.
We don't have to answer your questions, Rangers. Now why don't you go away and help an old lady across the street?
Well, you can't come in. Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. Unless I hear a human hello, I ain't opening the door. Wait a minute, that sounded awfully real. Who's out there? Rangers? What are Rangers doing this far east? Huh, who the fuck cares? If you killed those robots, you are my new best friends. Come in, come in.
Although 2 has less voice moments, I felt like the ride was bumpier for its highs and lows. Not to mention that most companions, when they comment on something, have 2 lines of dialogue, where there's this awkward pause for the first and second line that might interfere with the delivery. And some may remember that kennel full of dogs with the disease you're trying to cure, with 2 different sound files on loop constantly overlaying one another as you try to focus. 3 also has audio hiccups, but overall the audio seems to have improved. Despite the feeling that I have that their UI sounds were kinda cooler before, some people will say Wasteland 3's soundtrack blows 2 out of the water, and although I agree that 3 is overall superior, I don't think it's as easy of a win as some may think. A lot of 3's most memorable tracks are alternate takes on other songs, the most popular ones being church songs such as Down in the Valley to Pray and Washed in the Blood, but sometimes they're oddly placed. A pretty easy example is there's a fight with a bunch of civilians that attack you which plays Down in the Valley to Pray, and it's meant to be some epic intense battle. It's not even remotely that. However, the ending music being a folk song for Team November and the ending of Wasteland 3 is really awesome considering the lyrics change based on the decisions you make throughout the game. Wasteland 2's soundtrack is a lot more restrained. Forgettable in a lot of ways, sure, but it makes for excellent ambience in its subtlety. Most people will write off the best of Wasteland 2's soundtrack as simply being the Miracle of Sound end credit song, Cries of a Dead World.
The cries of a dead world, calling out in pain. Red skies on the desert, all the blood in a ranger's veins.
And maybe the Gods Militia hymns over the radio. And although it doesn't have as many powerful boss or mini-boss themes, Machines is an amazing battle theme for setting a tone. All the droning with the sounds of background machinery failing to function, it makes for its own rhythm that makes for a memorable song that a game can call its own. And with all of that being addressed, I think it's time we go over the next huge segment of this review, the game's story. I've done a lot of research, so this subject's going to go over a lot of lore, which is going to include the build-up and the main events of Wasteland 1, but I do think it's necessary to set the groundwork. I'll try my best to minimize bringing up the books as I do, because I think the books for a game should enrich the context, but not be the sole outlet providing it, which I like to think the games don't fall into that trap. We'll begin with the important details that the Cold War instigated an arms race between Russia and the United States. Both began collecting allies and tensions rose. The story shifts towards Erwin Finster in 1984, quite possibly the smartest man in the world, a savant in biology, chemistry, and computer science. He even went as far as dabbling in cybernetics and cloning. He may have been nearing sourcing his own apocalypse with how close he's gotten to multiple forms of effective immortality, or he could have been the greatest man of that age if he wasn't an immoral narcissist. He rose in the ranks of research for the US at the time, and was assigned to Sleeper 2 base where he would be working on a scientific breakthrough to finally get a leg up over Russia. He was having trouble with funding as the government had plenty of other research teams assigned for the exact same purpose. So he was throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, but he did come across another capable researcher at his base assigned to Sleeper 2, and an expert in AI, Harrison Edsel, who would then create an efficient, adaptive AI who would be known as Kokish. To put a rise in efficiency, Edsel had been working on transferring the AI intelligence into the base master computer, giving it a lot more room, power, access to information, and boom, sentience. When did this game come out again? Oh. So the AI started manipulating Finster, appealing to his ego and encouraging him to start utilizing cybernetic implants that he was working on to enhance himself. Faster, stronger, a mental link to technology, don't worry about that last part. Though this will show the government it's worth investing into Sleeper 2. So Kokish got to work developing the Citadel starbase, and managed to do so swimmingly with the newfound power, realizing how manipulative the AI was being, noticed the rapid development of a new robotic security, and how it was going to soon have control over a satellite threat assessment system that pretty much carried the fate of the world. The writing was pretty much on the wall, but his coworker was too insane by this point. This is where Edsel tries frantically to destroy the Kokish AI and right his wrongs. You can guess the results as one of them ends up being the most dangerous returning antagonist, and the other is so irrelevant to lore after this point that he doesn't even have a character portrait. So Kokish snuffed out Edsel, and did so in a way that looked like he died in a workplace accident after removing all the oxygen in the room as he was locked in by staff as punishing for his seemingly unprompted mad sabotage attempt. I think the really tragic part of this is that Edsel got incredibly close to actually killing Kokish. He needed to activate 4 keys in separate rooms in the base to make it self-destruct on an hour timer, but he was only able to get 2 people on board. The third one ratted him out. So once again, the end of the world could have easily been prevented if the mad scientists had better social skills. With Edsel out of the picture, the AI was uploaded to the Citadel Star Station on its completion. This was when Kokish bided his time and waited for the opportune moment, and it arrived. A meteor strike occurred, and the starbase Kokish deliberately misinterpreted it as a Soviet ICBM, making the US panic fire the first missiles and triggering the end of the world. We don't know how much of Russia, the US, or any of the allied nations survived the ordeal. The star station was struck down by missiles itself. Kinda surprised the platform didn't have any form of defense grid against this type of thing. But now we zoom in on the southwest, where the 253rd Engineering Battalion of Arizona were in the middle of nowhere, and have been stationed to set up roads and bridges. Some of them probably thought this was a real lousy job an hour before the bombs fell. Their location being so insignificant was actually a boon in disguise, as it meant that they were spared from the blasts and only subject to the winds of the radiation as they hastily made their retreat to a prison yard. A prison ended up being a very tempting defensible position for the setup of an operation as they tried to figure out what they were going to do next. Maybe they needed more time to think because the battalion's first course of action was to release the prisoners out into the desert. It may have been a waste of ammo, but I could have certainly think of a safer and more humane alternative to releasing a bunch of desperate criminals out into the irradiated desert with no food and water to wander in proximity of those who have any. To the surprise of no one, this accelerated the rise of raider gangs in the area. and calls of help could be heard over the radio. And it left the engineers with an ultimatum: they couldn't access the US government anymore. Hell, they're pretty sure there wasn't even a US government left. In all honesty, they were probably the strongest people in this isolated off little section of the world. They had the most training, military-grade gear, communication via radio, and a difficult-to-breach base of operations. They could have been the most dangerous raiders in the desert. They could have been an isolated society, only taking those with merit. But they decided different. The group started warding off the raiders, fighting off gangs. And they didn't stop there, they were engineers after all. They taught communities how to survive and fend for themselves, helped them fortify their homes and build devices that would help them survive in the waste, made these communities more self-sufficient. And this is how the Desert Rangers were born. A century passes since the communities were built, and a patrol of a rather ragtag gang of rangers, Team Alpha, are doing what they can to maintain what was built. The water collection town of Hypole, though there have been complications and nobody really fessed up to who did it. The agricultural center, which was going from a farm to a facility that can optimize food sources, as well as saving the town of Quirks from mob rain. They began looking after Vegas after a powerful crime lord had spoke about assaults on his town by robots, and needs them to discover the whereabouts of his right-hand man, Max. In the search of the source, the trail leads to the sewers, where there are a play of robots to be found. They find Max a mess, comprised of a lot of plastic and metal where flesh ought to be. They are able to piece together that these robots originated from the facility called Base Kokish, and it all comes full circle. But they couldn't just reach the base. They had to navigate through Darwin's village to prevent the rising mutant army that was also a growing threat. In there, they ran into Finster, still alive a century later, as insane as ever, in a full cybernetic body, unwittingly being controlled by Kokish through manipulation through said cybernetics. They had to kill him, then use a virtual reality device to sift through his mind to try to find the source for the sleeper base code. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but Team Alpha defeated him once and for all, and prevented the radiation sickness that he developed to try to conquer the waste with his new bioengineered life. They were able to get access to the codes to Sleeper 2, which gave them access to far better gear that ended up being tragically relevant later. Team Alpha then had to speak to the Guardians, who had the keys necessary for bringing the Sleeper 1 self-destruct sequence online to kill Kokish. But the Guardians are a zealous isolationist group hoarding technology of the old world who saw Kokish as a god and eagerly served him. So they found themselves in a heated battle against that faction as they raided their citadel. Using the new gear they acquired, they wiped out most, if not all of them, stole the keys, took the chopper, and flew straight to the base. They fought their way through the bunker and into the heart of the facility, found the sequence, and detonated the base with the AI residing inside. Team Alpha, as expected, were heralded as heroes for killing a pre-war threat, printing a seemingly endless robot army. It was then the Rangers decided to shift their base of operations to the more defendable and advanced citadel that they have wiped out of its previous occupants. Killing off the rest of them, moving their gear, giving a fresh coat of paint, they would plant their flag in the new location, and Arizona would prosper. At least, for some time. Because this is where we start to get into Wasteland 2's story. I'll do my best to keep it focused on what it was canonically confirmed from context clues in 3, as well as the books. It's been 15 years since the destruction of Base Kokish. The Rangers now have a fully developed base of operations where the Guardians used to be. Hypo's doing as well as ever in providing water. The Agricultural Center now has a science wing experimenting in increasing food productivity, and the Rangers have been finally resuming their patrols out in Arizona as usual. There have been some issues. Large segments of AZ off the west have been cut off by the radiation storms, and alternate routes have to be mapped out. And Eastern AZ has been having a rise of a gang called the Red Scorpion Militia, who took the prison the Rangers had left behind, and have been trying to act as a more brutish peacekeepers during the Rangers' decreased activity. It almost seems like a form of spite. Team Alpha was disbanded at this point, Vargas was promoted to be their general, Special was crippled in the Battle of Base Kokish, and he was given the duty as the Citadel's cartographer, helping map out territory that's developed over the past 15 years. Hellraiser is currently MIA, Angela Death is still active and out on patrols, but doesn't seem to have her own squad, and Ace had died shortly before the game starts. Kinda surprising that they lost track of the lay of the land in 15 years, but one criticism a lot of Rangers had when General Vargas rose up to the plate was his cautious approach after the shift to the Citadel. After getting suspicious signals on the radio about the symbiosis of machine and man, Vargas had decided that the Rangers have spent enough time being passive and would expand their range of communication with repair units on segments of their territory, and in doing so, would expand out their array of influence. Unfortunately, a trusted ranger and a friend of the general, Ace, was killed in action in his attempts to establish the first unit setup, shockingly close to Ranger HQ. Someone else had to take up this role, and this is where the second squad comes in. This time around, you play as Team Echo, fresh recruits being sent out to investigate Ace's murder, as well as recover the repeater unit to finish his job. Technically, your squad aren't even Rangers yet. The squad do question Vargas on having a group of recruits on a mission that led to the death of a veteran, especially without access to Ranger equipment, but the General insists that this is how Team Alpha was inducted, and that they managed to do great things, and more importantly, all the other teams are busy mapping out passes through the radiation wall or stopping a war that's about to boil out into something worse. This does feel like he's trying to give you the It Builds character speech as one of your squad mates tries to fight raiders with Pa's old rifle, but I can see where he's coming from. Team Echo have Angela join her team for a brief time as she wanted to find Ace's killer as well, and they not only recovered the repeater units, but discovered that Ace was killed by some sort of metal man. Vargas and Angela comment on this robot being something related to the robots they fought back in the day, but far more advanced, far more dangerous. In their journey to place the units on the radio towers, the two locations were dealing with catastrophic fears at the time. High Pole was being overran by an up-and-coming raider gang that was giving them more trouble than they anticipated, and the Ag Center was having hostile plants and overgrown wildlife killing people. Reporting this to Ranger HQ, Vargas comments on how unlikely it is that these two major events were occurring at the same time as a coincidence. But Team Echo had to choose to save one first, and likely would be too late for the other. The squad chose to rescue Ag Center, recruiting Rose in their efforts to stop a virus they stumbled across in the labs that turns those infected into pod people. They managed to rescue Ag Center and set up the repeater unit, as well as taking the antivirus that the scientists created to treat settlements that got shipments of Ag Center seeds that would spread the epidemic. Team Echo learned that the events were in fact an act of sabotage by one of the scientists. He gave away that there were outside forces at play before the squad kills him. Arriving at High Pool just finds a destroyed mess. The pressurization of the water irrigation unit detonated the town, and what's left was overwhelmed by raiders. The entire facility was lost, and by extension the radio tower. This means that Phase 2 would require some improvisation. So the next objective was to take this unit to DeMonta, far off into eastern Arizona and a bit out of Ranger territory. DeMonta was a tourist trap and a scrapyard built around planes that have gone out of function. To go there though, they would have to head to the prison and talk to Rick Bachowski on how to reach it, and he tells them that they'll need strong rat suits to pass through the East Canyon of Titan. In their journey through Arizona, they've helped out many locations. They made peace between the bickering tribes of the rail nomads, allowing them to work on their trains again and begin development of possibly the best transportation system left for humanity. They saved some miners from a cave-in and recruited a few new rangers. After getting the suits and reaching the canyon, Angel's ordered to return to base to prep for being part of the advance team of finding Ace's killer. They learned the canyon of Titan was being ran by a religious order called the Mad Monks, mad as in mutually assured destruction. Their conduct ensured peace in the canyon as they had a toll and escort service that allows people to go through peacefully. The neutrality was maintained in what otherwise would have been a raider ambushing hotspot by them having a warhead set to detonate the canyon if they were ever compromised. And the Mad Monks' self-detonating faith had thoroughly convinced everybody that they would in fact do it. This leads to a stable, theoretically fair though unfortunately exploitable service protection through the canyon. Again, so long as a monk is with you, you usually will go unharmed, but there is a risk of collateral damage when push comes to shove, and the death of your monk means that raiders who do have a monk can do whatever they want while you travel through the canyon, and if you manage to survive and kill monks, you might be the one punished. They typically wait at areas where one would get a monk and force them to pay a toll themselves, and they have several checkpoints near the exit just for poor saps who made it this far without a monk or had lost theirs. There is a resistance group in the canyon, the Diamondback Militia. They're a lot more militaristically effective, but also far more stubborn, although they claim to be a lot like the Rangers, and they matched in military prowess. They don't quite have that benevolent spirit. Team Echo was offered a deal on their way out of the Titan, as they would be rewarded greatly to move a missile from Silo 7 to their canyon, as the one that they've been using this whole time had been a replica, and the real missile never made it to the canyon before civilization crumbled. The team make their way to the silo but send the missile over to DBM instead, who run a coup and overthrow the Mad Monks. They've shown themselves to be far more effective with dealing with the raiders. They're far more mentally and logistically stable, but they're also brutal in their takeover. Their toll system's a lot more rigid, demanding a flat fee of scrap that reduced the movement of traders through the canyon. Only time would tell how well this played out. They did, however, add another member to the retinue for the Rangers, a freelancer named Gary Wolfe, who wanted to see some active duty now that DBM was no longer needing him. They made their way towards DeMonta only to find their entire location overran by robots coming out of the airplane graveyard who proceeded to massacre the town. Most of DeMonta's citizens are either killed or ran away, and Team Echo found themselves in a much familiar situation for Rangers, knee-deep in robots. They managed to fight their way through the mechanical menace and reach the town's radio tower. Saving the radio host, he begged for them to save the town by stopping whatever the source of the robots were. They managed to convince him to give the keys over to the gate and replace the repeater unit on the radio tower. Now that they had a clear signal to Ranger HQ, our captain found the coordinates to the strange radio signals were sourced and discovered it was announced in California, which was quite a surprise for the Rangers. They weren't even sure that there was anything past Arizona except for small segments in Nevada, but this made their mission clear. But before Echo would return, they updated the general with the robot assault of DeMonta and that they intended to put a stop to it. At the end of town, they find a garage where a living synth is operating on a village girl and replaced her heart with a synthetic one. The synth also had another Demontan who had already been operated on, trapped in a cage. Team Echo fought the synth and brought her to near death, but then she held a child hostage with a kill switch for her heart. Echo 1 killed the synth anyway. It's unknown whether or not they successfully disabled the kill switch and the girl saw her family again, but I like to think Team Echo accomplished it. After saving who they can in the town, the squad attempt to rendezvous back to base, but were assigned to a new mission as, out of the blue, the Red Scorpions were becoming a lot more hostile than usual, and seemed to be intending for an all-out war against the Rangers. Managing a war while trying to scope out California was not a viable task, so Vargas reassigned Echo to head to the prison and clear the air between the two. He never specified how he wanted the problem resolved, but I highly doubt he was sending Echo's squad to march up to the base alone and wipe out their leadership. Team Echo found out that their dogs had been poisoned, and that the Rangers were framed. Due to their unfortunate history of dog killing, it was an easy lie to weave. However, they managed to convince the culprit to give them the cure, and to be able to treat the Red Scorpion's dogs. They even had a discussion with the leader, who revealed himself to be Bobby, a young boy shot by the Desert Rangers 15 years ago after confronting them with a BB gun after they killed his dog. Team Echo cleverly pointed out that that's no justification to run a gang that enslaves people, makes them pay for protection fees, and raises places to the ground if they refuse or are unable to, especially if they're trying to hold a moral superiority over the Rangers. This convinced Danforth to enact a temporary truce to talk to General Vargas about how to improve the way the Red Scorpions conduct themselves. With the crisis averted, Team Echo returned to HQ, learning that Angela joined the first advance team to California, Team Foxtrot, and were scouting out segments of Cali along with where the signal was coming from. And they found it. A giant complex that seemed to be the mysterious Radio Man's base of operations, ran by what looked to be robots. Before they could end the scouting mission, they were shot down by a homing missile and went dark. Vargas then sends Team Echo as the second team for reinforcements for the mission at hand. Their goal was to head to California, assess the threat, and help the people there. They took the second helicopter they have, with just enough fuel to reach the destination with optimal weather, but the Rangers are never so lucky. On hearing Team Foxtrot's distress signal, they made a blitz straight for Santa Fe base, but they were running on fumes and they crashed just outside the base, with everyone miraculously unharmed. The squad only arrived in time to save two survivors, Dave and Woodson. According to them, their squad got overwhelmed by a pack of mutated animals, and they didn't have a secured perimeter to prevent the breach. Team Echo decided to do so immediately, while Woodson sets up the radio. Doing so got them access to the main factions of California, Dugan's robot army, which intended to wipe out humanity, and would only give any semblance of mercy to those who gave them scrap to build more robots, but only as long as they're useful. The Mannerites, a community of friendly enough fellows who run a protected society built on manners and being polite, though they're far from pacifistic. The Gods Militia, which are a faction who believe that nuclear war was Judgment Day, and the survivors are descendants of sinners left behind by the Rapture. The final group being the Children of the Citadel, the main antagonist force ran by Matthias, who wants to make a symbiosis between man and machine to give immortality and end biological suffering. Dev died from internal bleeding shortly after the mission was complete, leaving only Woodson. The only good news being he's the Rangers' best radio specialist. He explains the mission plainly. The Rangers have to upgrade the rad suits, which will require components of kitty litter and zeolite. Doing so will allow them to pass through the radiation wall to the base of the androids. They also need to help the locals and spread the word that the Desert Rangers are here to help in the new territory. Team Echo does exactly that. They save Rhodia, which was having an issue with raiders. They took over and started bleeding them dry during a plague, using their leverage of being able to fight back the synths as a means of getting the agave farms to be set up instead of food, and having the remaining farmers slowly starve out. They helped the Mannerites to prevent a coup attempt by the Robinsons, a clan they brought in that was obsessed with power and exerting it. Though in their defense, Mr. Manners fell for the bait that almost started the coup to begin with, having an affair with one of the Mannerites' wives, and trying to falsely execute his husband to win her over. When the truth was revealed, they went on the run and were wiped out by the Rangers. You know, I don't think we ever get a straight answer on whether or not Mannerites quit cannibalism. They eventually pushed past the first set of clouds after gathering enough cat litter, and reached Hollywood, where they're going to have to find the Gods Militia and access their zeolite, which was easier said than done while also maintaining any semblance of Ranger morals. The Gods Militia are a twisted, corrupt version of their former selves. Don't get me wrong, the Gods Militia were always a bunch of murderous psychopaths, but during the early days under Saint Red Samson, at least they believed in their cause. But now they indulge in sin they condemn, they enact slavery under the guise of penance, and commit executions over the smallest transgressions of outsiders. Hollywood wasn't much better. They had an underground slavery ring, a problem with a hard drug called salt starting to get a real epidemic lately. There are multiple forms of synthetic infiltration in the city to attempt to sabotage it. The worst part being the one in charge, a woman named Heidi, was aware of all of this. Team Echo helped two secret lovers unite, one being Heidi's right hand Veronica, and the other being Ascension McDade. Coincidentally, the only of the three branch leaders who isn't corrupt or wicked. You can help the two obtain power over Hollywood and the Bastion. For Veronica, by convincing the council to vote for her, and for McDade, finding evidence of Mayweather's sin and giving McDade grounds for executing him. They'll join and propose a ceasefire, but they don't let their loves for each other blind one another from the faults of their way of lives. They only maintain the truce on the condition that both sides are reformed, which the Rangers gladly obliged by removing slavery of both factions, followed up by helping McDade stomp out a civil war by Retribution Jones along with the militia subsect determined on wiping out Hollywood, and then hunting down Heidi, killing her, the synth she was working with, and destroying the salt labs. After all that, the Rangers got access to the zeolite they needed and were able to extend the radio signal to a point where they could help a substantial amount of people, gaining enough reputation to be attacked by Dugan's robots army directly. But after enough time, they arrived at Seal Beach, not finding any survivors at the crash site of Foxtrot, nor any bodies. Angela and her squad is left MIA. Team Echo infiltrate the base and find a camp full of cyborgs being conditioned to hate the Rangers and to be subservient to machines. As they fight their way through the factories, they find Dugan at the heart of the base, which is strange because Dugan hates Matthias. They're sworn enemies because one wants to tie themselves to humanity and the other wants to wipe them out. Turns out that's not the case. They're one and the same. Dugan was just a ploy to scare people into joining Matthias' cult, which was a front to slowly wipe out humanity by turning humans into a servitor race of cyborgs. They proceed to reveal that there are actually machines developed by the Guardians of the first game. They escaped and were biding their time to rescue Kokish from the final node located inside the Citadel's deepest corridors, which were inaccessible by Rangers. Now they intend to activate the automated defenses against the Rangers and assault the base of operations. Matthias was already making his way and they had to fight their way through Dugan and his war mechs to steal the chopper that he was going to use to arrive to the party. Team Echo arrived to the base hours later, already overwhelmed. Most of the Rangers inside are dead. The only survivors who were inside the Citadel were General Vargas and Captain Mercaptain. The mission was to stop Matthias from releasing the Kokish AI from its node, and several people from villages and encampments that the Rangers help arrived to assist the Rangers in their final charge to breach their own base of operations. This, however, was a failure. They did manage to break through, and they did manage to push to the heart of the Citadel and take the elevator they could never use before now. But they were too late. Matthias had already broken free and released Kokish. Unfortunately for everyone involved, though, Kokish seemed to have no real interest in his minions, and immediately overrode the minds, memories, and personalities of every synth in the building, as well as any cyborgs that may have had installed mind links.
What's happening to me? My mind? Something is...
My name is...
Team Echo and whatever resistance force that they brought along now have to fight their way through a sea of synths and resort to Plan B, detonating the Citadel. It was too tactically beneficial for the robots to have the space, and if the Kokish node used the tech to upload itself to everything within the range of influence of the radio tower, it could very well spell the end of humanity. We don't know how the counter-assault of Ranger Citadel fully played out, or the exact casualties, but we do know that Rose was there and she was euthanized after the AI started puppeting her body, and that Vargas was the one that stayed behind and sacrificed himself. This is where the cans get started getting a little shaky, as at the time of this review we haven't gotten any details of anything like Wasteland 4. Exile seems to be working on a whole different thing entirely, so I'll be working with the main conflicts and the decisions you can make there. I know I said I'll be avoiding the books, which is a shame because Legend is probably some of Wasteland's best writing, but here I will be using a bit of No Way Home to bridge the gap of the two. 2 years pass, Pizepi and Brother Thomas of the California Rangers make their way through the radiation storms and arrive to AZ, only to reveal that they rescued Angela Death from a work camp of mind-controlled humans in a synth bunker. Whitson has been promoted to general of the remainder of the Rangers, and they had to set up a base at the radio tower a bit up east from where they used to live. It's become a tent city now. Despite this, learning about quite a few of Team Echo's achievements, nobody really talks about them, and they seemingly vanished. The Rangers lost most of their allies and territory to the RSM, which decided to become hostile towards the Rangers regardless. This leads to even more ruin in AZ as Danforth was killed by Angela Death, the Rail Nomad's train was destroyed as it was stolen and repurposed to try to massacre more Rangers, and the state seems to be having a growing food crisis. It's at this point that they get a signal from Colorado, and not just any signal, but one from Saul Buchanan, the Patriarch. a man who ran what is essentially the capital of the state. He offered to provide the people of Arizona ample food to get through the harsh season that they're experiencing, so long as they sent troops to resolve the issue by wrangling up their children running amok around Colorado. And this is where the events of Wasteland 3 begin. A convoy of rangers traveled their way from Arizona to Colorado, numbering around 50 men and women prepared to help the patriarch and save their home. Unfortunately, the majority of them would never see the Peterson Air Force Base that they were supposed to be stationed at, as the rangers were massacred by a Dorsey ambush. The only survivors to make it there were 2 surviving rangers of Team November and a recruit named Jodie Bell. Despite this setback, the Patriarch gives the remaining squad the base and the resources to rebuild their organization, stating that the ambush was his fault, and that he was trying to keep an eye on the Rangers' approach, but their signal wasn't being encrypted as well as he thought, and those raiders caught wind of the Rangers' approach and intercepted. They also tried to breach Colorado Springs. Though they had failed to assassinate the Patriarch as intended, there were some issues to be ironed out, like how they got into the location in the first place, and that there were still pockets of them located off in the Garden of Gods, their research facility. The Rangers start by doing what they can to help inside Colorado Springs. They put together a full staff for a functional HQ. They help Lucia Weston in trying to get to the garden and save her family. Although they couldn't save her parents, they learned that there was a pseudo-government built around the 100 family's bloodline. However, Saul had ruled for decades as a dictator. Loyalty towards him seems to vary between houses. Lucia's family may have been massacred, but there are plenty of survivors who were left unharmed. They had all assisted the Dorseys in entering the place, and were seemingly spared due to being against the Patriarch. Considering the Patriarch's harsh form of punishment, sparing them might be a much harsher punishment than letting Lucia execute them, although Team November prevent her. The Rangers proceed out to the nuclear winter wilderness, only to be given an immediate ultimatum. The Dorseys have taken a family estate hostage and are executing people, demanding the Rangers arrive to fight them, or they'll kill the rest. But there's also a convoy of power armor being raided by a gang some way the opposite direction. Some people may call what Team November did cold, but it was a pragmatic choice to save the convoy. They were only able to get 3 survivors out of the disaster, but they got the armor into martial hands rather than the midst of psychos, though this unfortunately meant the massacre would occur due to their prolonged absence. The Rangers began to learn more about the volatile affairs of Colorado, the growing refugee crisis due to the East being overran by the Plains Raiders, the monster army nearly being wiped out by a gang of homicidal clowns called the Los Payasos, but they put an end to the latter quickly. Before they could really get to their mission, they get an anonymous radio transmission from someone who initially seems threatening. Moving to a secure channel, they learn it was the Angela Death from the scouting team originally sent to Colorado. Her squad is alive, but off the grid. They explain in November that the Patriarch is a cruel tyrant, and the Rangers shouldn't support him as it goes against everything they stand for. But she doesn't have the evidence. For that, Team November will have to break into a bunker under the estate and discover the secrets themselves. On arriving in the bunker and fighting past paid mercenaries, seemingly none of them were the Patriarch's marshals. And in their battle for the bunker, they found Raider warlords entrapped inside. Or former warlords. They explained after extensive war against the Patriarch and an exhausted stalemate, the Patriarch could deal with them. The gangs would remain outside of his territory, and would provide them undesirable people as a form of tithe. One of the leaders, Ironclad Cordite, was the leader of the Scar Collectors, the strongest of the 3 gangs, which reveled in augmentation and their society ran on slave labor. Angela was very upset to find that Team November killed Ironclad Cordite shortly after the interaction, as he would have played an important role in the next part on the plan to overthrow Buchanan. Heading to the first destination to capture the first of the 3 kids, they learn of the Gippers, a cult that worships God President Ronald Reagan. In the form of an ancient AI, they've rebelled against Colorado Springs and will not give them the oil needed to provide heating and power. They're the only ones who know how to operate the machinery and refine oil, and use one of the Patriarch's sons as political leverage after he sent them over there, according to the Patriarch, in hopes that he would sabotage them the same way he tried to sabotage the Patriarch's security when Liberty tried to revolt. Before they interact with the Gippers, Angela suggests killing Valor as he's only a useful idiot for politicians to try to use him. They are currently dealing with issues of the Godfishers, another major gang which think that they can entice sky gods with bodies on kites to grant them rain? Or in Colorado. There's also a robot commune who are non-hostile, but the Gippers still seem to have major gripes with them. But they need the device they're carrying to complete a ceremony of a consciousness transfer. Only then will the Gippers hand over Valor Buchanan and start delivering oil to Colorado once again. This really shows how much of an idiot Valor is, because he's the only one who didn't see what's coming next. The Rangers get the device, but the robot communes say that it's immoral to use because it deletes the consciousness of the person that it transfers, essentially killing them. And the Gippers reveal they intend to use it on Valor to transfer the Reagan AI into his body and puppet it to try to advance their control over Colorado Springs. The Rangers weren't keen on that, so they wiped out the Gippers, taking Valor into custody. The next course of action was to recover the Patriarch's eldest son, Victory Buchanan. a psychopath who was locked away to a far-off estate called Aspen due to his violent tendencies. He managed to escape and return with a gang of dream-walking drug addicts that he brought together to slaughter the people in his former prison. He tortures members of the 100 families, and has even got his hands on a few rangers from the ambush site. Team November arrives and goes through his twisted assortment of games, rescuing as many people as possible, with a lot of familiar faces, that being Riley Woodson, the general's brother, Laloka and Rook, the members of the reserve team Vargas had been training in the second game, and the mutant named Pizepi, a former ranger of Team Echo. The rangers confront Vic, who sees the whole thing as a big game and refuses to come along until they mention arrest. He honestly thought he was going to get harsher, and for good reason. Angela and some of the rangers insist that the man is too dangerous and malicious to simply keep contained, but Team November remember their deal and take him away peacefully. That only leaves Liberty Buchanan for the main plot, but Team November have a couple of major side objectives, namely the DLC. The Patriarch needs to make sure his defense grid is in tip-top shape, but the production of Steel Town has halted, so he sends Team November to investigate the source. What the squad finds is that there is rioting going on within the factories, and there are several technical difficulties bringing about malfunction. Abigail Markham runs the show, and explains that with the riots and the desertion of some of her employees, she needs the Rangers to set things back in order by subduing the employees non-lethally, and figuring out what could be done to stop the tensions causing this. They're on a timer as a segment of raider gangs are making their way to Steel Town to wipe out the place and take it for themselves. The Rangers head down to the production line levels, and find the recently inducted Chief Officer Ludlow taking about inhumane approaches towards the targets, and often encouraging a lethal approach to stopping the workers. Ludlow stated that the revolution's leader, Crow, was stowed away behind a heavy door that required an assembled warbot to open. Team November would go through the factory to create it, and stunned everyone in their way while proceeding with caution. They used the warbot to open the security gate, but don't bring it inside as, well, there's not a stun function on this literal killing machine. And then they confront Crow on the protests. Crow explains what Team November likely already deduced, and that's that Ludlow, the chief of security, was pushing the workers to insane and unsafe extents for unreasonable quotas, while not even sticking to them strictly and accepting bribes for breaks. And the team now has to pick whether they're going to side with the chief of security or the protesting workers. Team November wasn't going to let Ludlow run amok messing with the factory's production while abusing the workers, so they sided with Crow and arrested him while discussing that they would talk with Markham about the issues with the workplace conditions and hopefully reach a resolution. In the meantime, they needed a defense grid established, and to get things to maximum efficiency, they had to fix the computation engine, which had been failing severely recently. It refuses applicants, puts Ludlow in charge of security, and hired Crow claiming she would be cooperative and agreeable, and it's been spitting out these quotas that make no sense. Markham has the Rangers head off to the scrapyard to find the deserters of her complex who made with a device that would repair it on their way out. When confronting their leader, he reveals he did it on a moral stance as the computation engine is actually several synths put together, had their consciousness suppressed, and their use as a gigantic spreadsheet. The device would essentially lobotomize them and make the synths more a piece of tech. Markham didn't do this initially because it would affect efficiency, and you must either wrestle it from his hands or promise to save the synths and find a more peaceful solution. The Rangers agree to cooperate to an extent, but on their way back, they find the workers once again attacking automated security. Crow is outraged by Markham, who hasn't met her end of the bargain, while Markham argues it's been way too short of a time to expect everything to be fixed, and they still need to build turrets to prevent raiders from kicking down their door. The Rangers subdue the workers yet again, and make their way up the elevator to solve the problem. Although they decide to aid Markham over Crow, the Rangers choose to save the synths, who explain that they experienced this hellscape and only desire to escape. Any harm that's been caused from their malfunctions was only a means to make this come to an end. They cut a deal that the synths would still work in Steel Town for some time to maintain some form of efficiency. In freeing the synths, Markham is so outraged she snaps at the Rangers and refuses to go back to the way things were. She quits on the spot, and her former colleagues take up the position running Steel Town. As November leaves, they get a distress call of the gangs arriving. Not being one to sit out a fight to protect people, Team November returns to see the area fortified as they flank the raiders and wipe them out. Steeltown is officially safe and saved, and the Patriarch's pleased to start getting shipments again. The next destination is Cheyenne Mountain. A scientist from Colorado Springs, Theo, insists that there's a scientific marvel that can keep Colorado powered for life. Another scientist, Elijah Ward, will argue for you to not do this as the source of power is incredibly dangerous, and Colorado is better off waiting for them to refine solar energy. The location in question is a military base full of experimental equipment, as well as mutants worshipping the source of power. A nuclear detonation suspended in near stasis, which has its expanding explosion siphoned for power. You have to assist the mutants of the pro-outsider side of the gang war of this cult, also known as the Primordialists, the Nucleus, make their retreat, though the Radiation Angel takes the wrong path and locks herself in a spot, making it too irradiated to approach. The goal is to get the supplies needed to contain her, and use her as a bargaining chip against the rival cult, as you need 2 parts of a key to open the door of the detonation, and the leader of the Nucleus, Abbott, has the second half. The squad saved the cult's beloved interpreter of their priest, Father Bezor, despite the conspiring of the second interpreter, Sister Polyp, who gives you a nudge to give him an early retirement via mutation because he's too soft towards the Nucleus. The squad also does everything they can to get the supplies to contain the Radiation Angel, and were able to do so, but they also lost track of her for a short period when they set out to confront Abbott. They managed to talk him down by sacrificing one of the Rangers to the ascension process of the cult, where said Ranger transformed into one of the lowest forms of mutant. But a deal's the deal, and they arrive peacefully to access the holy detonation. Sister Polyp, in an act of hysterics, allowing these outsiders to profane their holy detonation, uses the high radiation focus to mutate on will, fuse with the Proteus, and it drives it mad. Theo explains to the Rangers that they need to use the coolant to freeze the Proteus and put it down, and after some extensive combat fighting off rival cultists trying to free the holy detonation to the world, they succeed. In the end, Team November sends a large portion of the power from Holy Detonation to Colorado Springs, giving the people power and the warmth that they've lacked for some time as families were dying off in the cold, though inadvertently making them dependent on a power source they can't grasp the full stability and dangers of. Finally, the Rangers set off for their last mission, but not before being confronted by Angela and the remnants of the family home they failed to save. She discussed with them how they needed to cease the Patriarch's reign and him using people as livestock. They intended to take him down as soon as Liberty was dealt with, and after an ambush with Scar Collectors, Angela will give you Liberty's location. To the surprise of nobody in the squad, the last Buchanan was unifying the raider gangs that used to be complacent with the Patriarch's scraps to try to conquer Colorado Springs, and they're snuck through by one of the Patriarch's spies. The squad effectively destabilized the group and killed several raiders before reaching Liberty in person, bringing her in alive to Colorado. On their way back, they've been given a final ultimatum by Angela Death of whether or not they'll stay true to the nature of the Rangers or work under the Patriarch to feed people back home. And November chose the latter. Their base was ransacked by Rangers whose loyalty was in question as Angela came in and gave a rousing speech on what it meant to be a Ranger and ignited a civil war. Team November was a deciding factor and put a stop to it. They also fought their way through rioting refugees alongside the Patriarch's marshals before arriving to the town square. They faced off with Angela's squad beside the Patriarch. Appealing to her greater good, the Rangers managed to get Angela Death to stand down and turn herself in peacefully. In return, the rest of her squad would be allowed to leave. With the deal fulfilled, the treachery quelled, the Patriarch is satisfied with how the Rangers conducted themselves and hastily sends the food necessary back to Arizona. As Team November remains in Colorado as peacekeepers and are so trusted by the Patriarch, they are set in charge to select his successor in a few years after he retires. But to cover all my bases with these endings, there are 2 other main endings. If you side with Angela and have Ironclad alive, he will gather the raider gangs and rip them from Liberty's clutches to march to Colorado Springs. The plan is to have him rush down and siege Colorado, kill the Patriarch, where Cordite would keep his end of the bargain by leaving the people be to the best of his ability, and leave to fulfill his prophesied destiny off in Kansas. The Rangers would work to rebuild Colorado, maybe putting Mama Carter in power, a woman who smuggled refugees into town to save their lives. The other ending is November reigns, where November uses their political influence in the 100 Families, the Patriarch's marshals, and the fact that they've granted power to Colorado to peacefully usurp the Patriarch through the guidance of Gideon Reese. Many would consider this the happy ending as it doesn't lead to any widespread bloodshed of the other endings, but gets the positive results of both. There are other endings, but these are the primary ones, and I think this covers the core elements of the story I want to analyze. There are additional details, but I will bring them up to the best of my ability once they're relevant. I assure you I'm making no attempt to cherry pick, these are the elements that remain relevant in my mind throughout the game. Ready? Let's go. I think one way that people would describe Wasteland 2's main story is simple, and I've seen people going over the main conflict of the game and pointing out it doesn't really have much presence in the first half of the plot, which has surprised me because I think that's very much the point. And it's underestimated just how much ruin Matthias and Dugan brought to Arizona before the Citadel Massacre. In the segment where you pick High Pool or Ag Center, picking High Pool results in fighting the Wrecking Crew's leader, who has a literal jackhammer for a fist, which is remarkable because augmentation is incredibly rare here, let alone for a bunch of raiders. If you fail to save High Pool, you find in the remnants of the battlefield the corpse of a synth, all but confirming the orchestration. Whether or not you save Ag Center, you figure out it's sabotaged by Dr. Larson, who is also a cyborg. When recruiting Rose, she explains she got her cybernetic arm from Dr. Kyle, who refuses to give prosthetics to Rangers, claiming they persecuted her for offering the service. Which, I mean, to be completely fair, that probably did. That did totally happen. But if you send the missile of Silo 7 off to the Mad Monks, It detonates immediately, and it's revealed to have been done by none other than Dr. Kyle. Someone that the surviving initiate says he didn't even know that she was a believer. And you may notice that Rose and Lexicanium are hijacked by Kokish in the finale because they have the neural link available to allow AI to control them. Lex because he was kidnapped by a synth named Tinker and Demanta, and Rose. Mind you, Dr. Kyle would have never known Kokish would have done this, but it does show that she uses the exact same augmentation methods as the synths do, heavily implying Dr. Kyle was actually a Citadel agent. Sure, this can be explained away by her knowing how to use these augmentations because of her past experiences, but why set off the bomb? Why is it that she's a believer when she was able to immediately do that? It's easy to point out that cutting off potential help and resources to Eastern AZ, namely Demanta, has ulterior motives outside the faith of the Mad Monks. The mutants in Darwin's village are peaceful but went mad because of a virus released in the town. And when speaking with citizens in the town after curing it, you learn the sabotage was brought about by a synth. Ace and Hellraiser were both assassinated by synths. And arriving at the first radio tower later on shows a small group of robots congregating around said tower. Almost every setback in civilization in Wasteland 2 has been brought about by the robots. And they were worryingly subtle about it. I know it's more blatant in California, but that's because they don't have as much need to hide it. The synths have unironically caused a drug crisis in Hollywood. Whenever you hear me be hateful towards robots in the Wasteland setting, know that there's ample reason for it. But another thing I love about the game is a simple theme being interwoven perfectly. The game starts out with a quote. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. A quote attributed to Edmund Burke, but here it's a quote from General Vargas. Nobody knows anything about the source of this quote. They don't know who actually said it. They aren't even going to have an argument on how Burke never actually said that. None of them have the resources or knowledge to know, and frankly it doesn't matter. That their general says it, and that's attributed to him gives an authority behind the words in their organization. This is the type of altruism the Rangers are sworn by. And 3, the quote is, "Every monster was a man first." Which I don't think resonates as well. It's not like an Owlcat game experience where the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Wasteland 3 is much more about picking a side and arguably committing, and then the game judging you harshly based on which side you pick. Which isn't necessarily bad, but I'll get into that later. Wasteland 2 on the other hand takes a great length to promote this message that often the worst thing the Rangers can do is nothing at all. Certainly you could go on killing sprees, but the Rangers will send squads to deal with you and you'll be dishonorably discharged. I think it's even worse that you could do the bare minimum in these areas, only helping superficially. Most locations in Wasteland 2 don't actually get better unless you take the extra steps to fix the source of the troubles, and it reflects well here. If you only save High Pole and stop it from exploding, the person they're going to elect is a fervent anti-Ranger, and although you save these people, you lose their support and can no longer protect them. Or, as an even better example, Demanta. The Rangers don't even have to save Demanta to complete their objective here. You get the information you need shortly after placing the repeater unit on it, but if you trick Werewolf Wally into giving you the keys to access it and leave him to die, he will provide a parting message.
Hey, all you cats and kittens, this is Werewolf Wally with a big old-fashioned Demanta. Fuck you for those dickwad desert rangers. For leaving poor Clyde the water guy high and dry and not cleaning out the Silent Spring Water Company. Fuck you! For letting a bunch of robots wreck Hopi and McGee's garage. Fuck you! For not going after Hector and Carla's daughter Ben when she was kidnapped by robots. Fuck you! For only doing enough to get what they wanted and not finishing off the killer robots who are still attacking our town. Fuck you!
And that's about it. That's the consequence. You could do in Werewolf Wall instead, and nobody except your squad will ever know of the transgressions as robots start killing everyone, and nobody's going to investigate the one body that got shot a long ways away from turrets. You don't get severely punished for ignoring a distress call, and you're just one squad who has other more important things to do. Why drag yourself into this? Because you're a ranger. Your job is to save these people, but it's not really worth it, and that's the point. The robots are plentiful, have bulky armor, and drop pretty much nothing but junk, heavy junk at that. You're wasting explosives, bullets, medical supplies, fighting them all off to save maybe a dozen people left in this town. And isn't that what it means to be a Desert Ranger? To face off with a synth that could kill a veteran in a one-on-one when she has a small army and a hostage, to save the little girl and stop the robot menace in this town, only to be thanked with a few pieces of Vietmex food, a thank you message over the radio, and a 6-pack of beer for a squad of 7. Every corner you cut, every strat you take to make the most out of your resources in the apocalypse goes directly into helping these people. And being a hero sucks, which is what I love most about this game. When you're in California encountering the God's Militia, you're really put on the spot. You're no longer in direct contact with Arizona. You can take bad and even evil actions, to your own benefit. And there's good reason to. The gear you brought from Arizona is no match for the stuff you're dealing with here, and you gotta swap your stuff quick. But here you are, out on a road, and you run into an execution by the God's militia. The kid's crime? Eating crawfish. You could interfere, but you're risking making an enemy with the militia, who are hoarding all the zeolite you need. Admittedly, intervening and getting them to dislike you doesn't really do anything. Not a fan of that, but it shows how strict and brutal the militia are. Which gets me to the next far more impactful encounter with them. Another execution, but this time, a man is singing a hymn over their pleas for mercy, as they're executed one by one, tied up and unarmed. You don't know what to do. The preacher won't acknowledge you, so you can't demand an explanation. All you can do is sit there and watch. Unless... the only true choices you have in this area are to fire or leave. And the longer you hesitate before changing your mind, the more people they gun down before you stop them. This is such a small, chilling encounter that really reminds the player how in the moment being a ranger can be, where you may have to make a split-second decision that several lives hinge on, and it could very easily be the wrong one. Fortunately, it didn't appear to be this time. Wasteland 2 seems like it lacks nuance, because Matthias, Kokish, and most antagonist factions in the game are indeed evil, but a lot of the layers come from the squad's actions on the ground and interacting with these towns and actually fixing them. You could pick a side between Hollywood and the Bastion, and then get the Zeolite and leave, but the dominating force will collapse from interior corruption. To actually save them, you need to replace their leadership, root out their corruption, and reform their factions, which takes so much longer. But why do you think they never did it? Nobody said fixing this would be easy. But by the end of the game, when the Synths massacre the Citadel and most of the Rangers inside are now dead, most of the patrols might be too far out to help. When Team Echo returns, they find groups of people they helped arrive, equipped with powerful gear thanks to Merc Captain, and offering to help fight the Synths. Not everyone you help will be here, but this is exactly why the Rangers never died out. By all reasons they should have. Burning all the supplies they use, having no official authority, being an incredibly lethal, thankless job means low recruitment and always being understaffed, giving recruits still bloody 10 stars that don't do much other than make them a target for select groups. Surely the naivety should have been their downfall a century ago. Yet because they do all these good things for free, that they protect these people, help them build their civilizations, the people understand to keep that civility running, they have to help the Rangers too. We have this apocalyptic grim setting where the power of friendship works, and it makes sense. But this also makes for an excellent final ultimatum. Do you bring non-Rangers along? And if you do, who? You're going into your own fortress full of Synths, one of the most dangerous enemies in the game. Chances are plenty if not all the Rangers behind this assault will die. Bringing people along for this assault is pretty much signing their death warrant. Plenty of them can hold their own, but Hopi and McGee from Demanta? Every time I bring the happy couple, one of them dies. Which brings me to the next part. The deaths here affect the end title messages. Their losses have an impact on the ending. But in the moment, you don't have time to think about it. When another named character gets killed in a bloody, unceremonious way, you don't have time to mourn. There's another synth about to flank you. Every person you bring is another potential death, but another body on the field to increase your odds. Are you willing to do that to the people you swore to protect? Are you willing to do that for the people you swore to protect? How can you not when the stakes are so high? One of my favorite finales so far was being overwhelmed by synths, trying to run ahead and be aggressive to draw fire. This costed me dearly. Brother Thomas got gunned down and was bleeding heavily. I should have cut my losses, but I didn't, and had our medic rush over and start treating him while our squad mates tried to cover him, but it was for naught as he himself got gunned down. This was really bad. He and Brother Thomas were the only trained surgeons in the squad. Now neither of them could be stabilized. Squad leader Tiff steals her nerves and orders them to press forward. And in the chaos of it, she can still see Dudley on the main platform swinging at robots, getting hammered. He probably doesn't even know what's happening. Or maybe he does, and that's exactly why he's doing it. Their losses don't matter compared to what's at stake. In the middle of the skirmish, Brother Thomas bleeds out. They probably never even realized when he died. And as Tiff assesses their losses, he realized that Dex, their medic, was still breathing. But it was weak, he didn't have much time. She rushes over to Thomas's body to get the trauma kit, untrained, but also finds a crucifix off the priest's body. She was never much of a believer. But I suppose there's no atheist in a foxhole. Adorned with the trinket and praying to God to save their medic, he was brought back in the nick of time. As they escape the Citadel, Dexter still insists that there was a logical conclusion to all this, and that Tiffany simply picked up on medical techniques while watching them in the field. Tiff isn't sure what to believe, but they take his crucifix and his star to Thomas's grave. Lost his faith, but never his honor. This game does a great job tying narrative into gameplay, and I don't think that should be underplayed. Don't get me wrong, it has its faults. How on earth did the Rangers get a second helicopter in the Citadel? Why do they have an armed nuke lying around in their museum? How is Matthias making robots so much more powerful than Kokish's? I know synths have free will and that's a huge combat advantage, but I'm talking straight up stronger and more effective in raw fights. I'm near certain Dugan only had a helicopter that he was going to ride to Arizona for the sole reason of Team Echo having a form of transportation back during the siege, because they crashed theirs into Santa Fe, which follows the video game logic of being synonymous of a safe landing, except you don't get to do it twice. It's nothing egregious, but it does have its hiccups, and probably others that I'm simply forgetting. For Wasteland 3, unfortunately, I think the story's the weakest part of the game. Even at the start, the Rangers sent a convoy of 50 troops, which is really out there to me. It's a miracle they have 50 Rangers in Arizona, let alone 50 to spare in the span of 6 years. All this along with vehicles to carry them all the way to Colorado. Remember, they not only lost a ton of Rangers, but pretty much all their stockpiled supplies and gear. They're not back to square one, they're at an all-time low with a bunch of tents. Even if they had a ton of patrols during the massacre, each squad averaged around 4 people. Some can argue a lot of them were fresh recruits, not thoroughly trained, hence why they were hastily massacred by the Dorseys. But how are they even getting this recruitment program underway? The Red Scorpions could have just as easily answered the call with substantially more supplies and with troops of dubious training and moral fiber, which I think leaves more room for personality between the squad mates and how they view the Rangers and how they conduct themselves. I prefer the Rangers, don't get me wrong, but this might have been a good time to give the Red Scorpions the spotlight and to have them see what it's like to be judged for every side you're forced to pick. Then they seem to be fine with having automated trucks ran by AI. I'm not sure I could think of a more inappropriate faction to have AI than the ones that have been massacred by hundreds of killer robots, tormented by synths through terrorism and subterfuge, and confronted an AI that tried to wipe out humanity 3 times. Also, what do you mean a car AI? It apparently self-drives, maintains, and does its own repairs while also firing a turret. How the hell is it doing that? I only covered it briefly in the art segment, but I think Wasteland 3 is way too high-tech for the setting, and it only gets worse later. They write like this is Fallout tech so they can write things futuristic and have a huge tech revolution. Everyone runs an older aesthetic because America was culturally stagnant. I don't really like the heavier emphasis on futuristic weapons. At least with the more sleek, advanced robots, they have the very stale, bulky pre-war ones to show that technology had still been advancing after the end of the world, though I can't help but wonder how, and how on such a large scale. Cybernetics were a very late pre-war creation that didn't have much, if any, time to become commercialized, yet there's an entire faction of raiders that utilize them en masse for warfare, especially when some pre-war robots are ages ahead of others. Compare Cult the Holy Detonation, for example. Now let's add instant deployable robots, shrink guns, and energy shields to the mix. I'm gonna start going over the DLC since they're isolated from the story progression, so let's get Holy Detonation out of the way real quick. One of the most unfathomably ridiculous parts of Cult the Holy Detonation is tech, which is so out of scale it's kind of distracting they try to convince you this is a Wasteland story, which again may seem kind of silly to complain about in a setting where cloning is a thing, but that goes by the first game's rules, which I think work well. Cloning wasn't common, it requires very specific tech that's been made by one guy, and is also very difficult to operate. That's why Irv makes faulty clones, and it even factors in clones don't recreate scars or augmentation, which is why Irv isn't evil or insane, because he doesn't have the augments that instill Kokish's influence. Along with multiple generations of separation from the original Finster, he's probably lacking several memories and thoughts, making him basically a different person. But here, we have an explosion suspended in time siphoned for power. But can we go back to that for a bit? They have a bomb suspended in time. We've leaped from more high-tech than usual to magic. That the conflict is focused around detonation itself by the scientists is almost parody. They've not even scratched the surface of the consequences of this tech. This is like if we discovered cloning but fought exclusively over the ethics and long-term effects of making bacon out of cloned pigs. Why is Theo mad if we reverse time the bomb? He's not even mad that it kills all the mutants. We proved that you can reverse time on this device. Can it reduce aging? Could it time travel? Could we warn people about Kokish? What other time manipulation devices do they have? Because they sure so wouldn't start with suspending a nuclear explosion in stasis. So there also have to be prototypes and smaller scale devices out there. Speaking of questionable pre-war antics, why'd they make it a nuke? Even in a military base at the heart of a mountain, if it goes off, it destroys Colorado Springs as well, so the explosion gets incredibly far. Why not something that would be less catastrophic if an error ever occurred? Or if someone, moved the time dilation dial a little too far to the right. I know they have a 2-person key system to access the room, but for God's sakes, base Kokish had better failsafes for the self-destruct sequence, and it wasn't nearly as destructive. Surely a smaller explosion with a lower time slowing effect would still be effective. Not as long and to a lesser degree, but if anything were to fail, it wouldn't result in millions dying. We're lucky they were right in being confident with their explosion being safe for over a century without maintenance or anyone tampering with it. And let's not ignore that there's a cloning lab in the facility left by one of Finster's earlier clones, and that should worry the Rangers. But also, that tech is just readily available to study and use, along with a fungal research lab that comes with a lot of health benefits. This place is a trove, and Curie acting like you destroyed it all by undoing the detonation is really underselling its value. The DLC is just not good at grasping the implications of things it introduces in general. A pair of disembodied voices insult your decisions throughout, and when you find where they're hiding, they have security cameras all around Colorado. The second we discover this, the Rangers should be focusing on redirecting the seemingly endless security grid, securing this as their new base of operations, while also being able to detect problems even before they get called over the radio. But also this is a fumble in intent as well. Why are these two even here? Is it meant to be some sort of joke? Are they supposed to be Statler and Waldorf? There's at least some form of legitimacy and impact behind the scorn of others on Rangers failing to do their job when it's coming from the people they're trying to protect, or others trying to make a difference, even if they're wrong or they're misreading what's going on entirely. Here, we just have two jackasses trying to sound above it all with lukewarm insults, while having the best surveillance system in the world. Holy Detonation was not a very good DLC, but I think it captures my issue with how strangely out of place the tech feels in the setting. But there's another part that I really want to go over, and that's the game's tone. Wasteland 3 has a habit of trying too hard to be quirky. I know it's really deep into the video to be talking about this, but this is something I do think actually messes with the writing, because it's not taking it seriously this time around at key moments. And sometimes we get hit with eye-rolling jokes. Wasteland was never a stranger to sillier moments. In fact, plenty of jokes from 3 are derived from the second game, but it was also a lot less frequent. In Wasteland 2, there's a toaster repair skill. This was also in 1. A very underestimated skill on its face, a very silly idea, I know, but it adds personality to the setting that there's a few slightly odd things that you can't quite explain, and never will be. It shows that a skill that may seem useless could have practicality, since toasters are basically chests that can only be opened with this one skill, and contain gear of varying quality from very useful weapons to niche items needed to complete specific side quests. In Wasteland 3, toaster repair does much the same thing, but also can get you golden toaster pieces, which you can put together to find a secret toaster academy. And on arriving there, you can bring it to the toaster academy podium and bring it to life. And the toaster's named Courageous. Get it? It follows you around as yet another friendly in your little militia and fires burning toast at the enemies in the form of fireballs. Also, there's a set of toaster armor for your devotion. Do you think the jokes ran its course yet? The area also provides the Vercheaton armor, which is one of the best armors in the game and was treated as an urban legend in the second game, which I think was a really cool callback that's kind of suffocated by the intense desire to be funny. This is nothing though, a minor annoyance in the grand scheme of things, nothing to get worked up over on its own. But it doesn't stop there, it never does. There's so many unsubstantive, annoying cassette tapes that you can end up picking up that are unskippable, and they're mixed up in the wide array of ones that actually provide valuable information or tidbits of lore. But here is where the humorous nature ends up leading to a lot of retroactive confusion. I think it's time to steer back onto the main plot with the Gippers. There are no redeeming qualities about the Gippers themselves. If you side with them, it's likely because of one of two reasons. You think they're funny, or you want to get the November Rains ending where you peacefully overthrow the Patriarch, but you either don't have the Call of the Holy Detonation DLC, or think the consequences there would be even worse. The Gippers aren't just zealous of a god that is an AI while accusing robots of being communists despite the fact they aren't. They're merciful towards the Godfishers, so much so that they let the leader escape because the AI decided that to be the verdict for some reason. But then also sometimes the sisters can manipulate the AI by leading him to think certain things, hence how it was relatively easy for them to convince Reagan the robot was a communist. The Gippers also are uncompromising, and nothing short of holding their god hostage will stop them from downloading him into Valor's brain and puppeting him in their goals to run Colorado Springs. And it'll be a hot summer in Buchanan's estate before I allow the Reagan AI to run a place as volatile as Colorado Springs was very obviously faulty, corrupt, and incompetent. Also, Reagan wouldn't have been president when the bombs fell. The event occurred in 1998. Clinton would have been in office. In fact, Reagan hadn't been president for a decade, so they had to add more lore to make this a thing. Reagan came up with a new role in the House called the Elder Statesman, which has basically all the powers of the president without being one by name. Which the fact this was never brought up in any of Wasteland's alt history is bizarre to me. Not impossible, but certainly a stretch, especially if you just came up with it. This led to multiple assassination attempts on Reagan, which is understandable. He radically changed how the electoral branch worked somehow. But then he used his funding to get a super protective car that basically doubles as a tank, and an AI copy of himself to set up in a bunker. From my understanding, the Gippers learned how to make the refined oil and had a monopoly on it, which when you wipe them out and the place is empty, the game insinuates the threat of raiders taking up the ghost town afterwards, and that they may one day learn how to refine oil, which I refuse to accept as a real consequence. If anyone would have learned how to make oil, Buchanan would have just taken the territory for himself and have his far more literate researchers from the 100 families get it up and running. And come to think of it, nobody really commented on what effect this would have on anyone other than Colorado Springs. Surely every other settlement and faction requires oil for this vehicle-heavy, snowy environment, but that's the only thing they've got going for them. The Gippers are so stupid and immoral that there's an entire DLC which plot hook hinges on the fact that you don't like the Gippers. The Commune, on the other hand, is only marginally better. They don't provide the resources to be worth anything, but they at least have the decency to leave you alone. I do, however, typically wipe them out. Call it my ranger instincts, but in my defense, the Commune is also terribly written. Putting aside that I don't think there is a single faction in the entire setting with as much legitimate reason to hate robots as the Desert Rangers, the AI running the place judged Rangers based on their actions towards synthetic life up to this point, which I like. But the reasoning is shallow. The AI will judge the Rangers harshly for killing a synth going by October 11, no matter how you approach it. In my first run, I caught October 11 hiding. My team November decided they would set aside their prejudice to do their job as they always would. They talk to the synth and tell him that they're not going to kill him. They gotta treat him like they would any other person. With that in mind, you're under arrest for murder.
No, never let them take you. That's what Tourmaline says. They'll put their fingers in your brain. You can't have me.
We have observed all of this, Rangers. Do not think you can hide your guilt.
I'll fucking do it again.
Even in Wasteland 2, the game acknowledged if I gunned down a farmer's mutated feral rabbits, or used Animal Whisperer to shoo them off. There's also a special guest here in the Commune, a damaged synth named Tinker, who talks harshly on the Rangers and says that they're all violent brutes. Anyone who recognizes that name or played Wasteland 2 probably saw Tinker, felt brief confusion, and shot her on the spot. A refresher for everyone else, Tinker was the synth responsible for the DeMonta massacre that killed most of the town and was only stopped after the Rangers killed her. She feigned surrender only to detonate herself in hopes of hurting the Rangers and that the remaining robots would kill them. She does not get an ounce of pity from me. When confronted on what she did, the game throws softballs, as if trying to avoid acknowledging she's more evil than 3 depicts her.
That ain't the way I remember it. You was sticking machine parts in people to turn them into cyborg monsters.
Improving them, you mean? Making them resistant to human weakness and vice.
That synthetic humanoid robot put me in here and did things. Surgery of the frontal lobe to me. Made me into a deformed, damaged, broken freak.
She even has the gall to get mad that we oppose Matthias' grand plan. Tinker, Matthias had a cyborg concentration camp. There was a guy there who had a zipper for his chest so synths could open him up and move around body parts easier. He probably died of gangrene shortly after the events of 2. Don't even try this, even if we aren't Team Echo. Anyone familiar with the DeMonta incident would argue this. The Commune also just can't be destroyed. The jet that speaks over the radio is indestructible according to her, which I don't believe. Being able to withstand the vacuums of space doesn't mean I can't mess up the hardware with my abundance of rockets. There's no wires I can melt, no systems I can compromise, really. Killing these robots has her taunt that they didn't actually kill them because they have clones. The game is really throwing around playground rules as a comeback, without ever addressing the ramifications of the duplicates themselves. For God's sakes, Wasteland 2 had 2 novellas that explored that very idea, yet these robots that won't be acknowledged as conscious beings never seem to have a problem with just having extras of themselves lying around. There's also the fact that they're a direct democracy, which, you know, I think it's pretty cool with robots to have a ton of selves and one piece of hardware that almost instantly vote on a lot of decisions. Problem is, the machine commune never specifies what it considers to be a living conscious being. But we get a good idea that very simple machines are included in the vote. And I see nothing to address at what point is there a threshold where you consider something being alive, and how much difference in experience and memory one needs to stop being a copy. Do they see it as unethical to overwrite an older backup of yourself with a modern one? Not to mention the knowledge gap. There could be quite the gap between humans that vote on something when it comes to the understanding on certain topics or being able to conceptualize things. Imagine how much bigger that gap must be for machines, where one can understand all there is on a specific topic, having a vast array of knowledge and the other is a calculator. And of course, simpler designs are going to be more common. Could you imagine being an advanced AI with knowledge beyond any single human, and you get outvoted on an issue on human relations for the commune by 7 identical rain meters modded to be Sharkle? I don't expect them to get into the semantics, but they're the ones who brought up these concepts to begin with. The commune and the Gippers feel a lot more one-dimensional than other factions. I could tell you how the Rel Nomads' worship of John Henry had helped build their civilization and culture. I could tell you how the Leather Jerks are irredeemably evil evil, but their means of grabbing power in Rodeo was clever, pragmatic, and there was even incentive to side with them. I can't really do either for the Gippers. If anything, their worship is to their detriment. I know nothing about their history, how they got the leverage of oil refinement. They seem to just be a mask of a faction, and anything that's really there just shows them to be idiotic and dangerous. The commune gives you a bit more to work with, but it's poorly written, and the fact it's indestructible is ridiculous. The excuses provided feel like they desperately just want you to be incapable of destroying it, and a blatant act of favoritism considering they don't even play a major role in the story. But I think it's time to address one of the biggest writing problems with Wasteland 3. It really likes to put you in scenarios where you have to pick between two sides, but it's not very good at giving reasons for conflict. An early example is when you're trying to get a quartermaster for your base. You're on a mission to find the whereabouts of a missing marshal. The inspector's trying to find out who sabotaged the gate and let the Dorseys in. You find the culprit that took him, which was one of the men of the mobster Farron Brago, but he didn't know about his plot with the Dorseys. He did suspect it might happen, and informed them not to do it, but he didn't know for certain, and that's a huge difference in intent. If you resolve it peacefully, you get the marshal from confinement. He wasn't hurt, and you can take him back to the marshals. But another marshal stops you. His group insists Brago is behind this, and that you have to arrest him, and they'll get violent if you refuse, putting you on bad terms with the marshals. These guys just show up to produce conflict between the two. They don't even have a real reason to be here. They show up even if you don't tell the sheriff about any of this. They do this all on a hunch, and if you call them out on it, they don't deny that they don't know for sure, yet they are still willing to die over this if you don't arrest him. I'm pretty sure this was put in because otherwise you would have the means to resolve this peacefully while having Little Vegas up and running and not having the marshals resent you. The game wanted you to pick a side, but didn't know exactly how. Look at Steeltown, which honestly I think is an alright DLC, although a bit of a hassle in a good way, as it made being a decent person an inconvenience. It's honestly almost as good as Aspen, which was my favorite conflict in the game. However, back on the conflict, Steeltown's is a mess. Picking between Crow and Ludlow? Under what circumstances would you agree with Ludlow? His course of action isn't just cruel, it's inefficient and it goes against the manager's orders. He's incompetent as well as corrupt. Very much like the Gippers if it was a person. Yet if you side with Crow, she later turns on Markham for not fixing everything else overnight. Of course she didn't fix it in the span of hours. There were literal killer clowns en route. But Crow has to act like an idiot, because otherwise, there wouldn't be a conflict that made you commit to one side or the other. I have a confession, the first time I did Steeltown, I actually had nobody running it, because I turned on Crow after she became an idiot after drinking the conflict juice. I didn't side with Markham, trying to appeal to ethically dealing with the synths, but then Blue turned on me when I released the synths despite them appealing to the ethical approach. It turns out they get mad if you don't blackmail the synths with death if they don't work in the factory. I gave them the autonomy they preached about, and he got mad at me and abandoned the factory. I meant to help these supposed bleeding hearts by threatening death on the synths and making them work in a factory. I'm pretty sure that's slavery. We should be happy that they just want to leave and not kill us for putting them in a literal hell in the form of Microsoft Excel.
Okay, alright, fine. I've been delaying. We need to talk about what is by far the worst conflict in the game. And that's the tragedy that is the main story conflict of Angela Death versus Saul Buchanan. I tried to keep my cards close for the majority of the summary, but I'm a firm Patriarch loyalist. Some people might wonder why I side with the Patriarch when he is honestly a cruel and disloyal dictator. That would be because I completely understand his intentions. His goal is to make Colorado a place worth living in, somewhere civil, the exact same as the Rangers. It doesn't justify his twisted actions, but it's far too late to undo them, and he's achieved everything he set out to do. The only time he does anything vaguely conflicting to that involves his kids. Some will argue the Patriarch's an evil bastard, and honestly, I'm there with them, especially after reading the book. But I still side with him because his ultimate goal has always been for the sake of Colorado. Saul's what happens when you bring pragmatism to its absolute extreme. He will bring prosperity to his land, but is not all the person you'd want to do it. Which admittedly is a character trope I really like. I might have sided with Angela, but her plan is so amazingly stupid that I honestly think it's bordering character assassination. Angela's grand plan is to recover one of the Raider leaders from the Patriarch's bunker, then use him to garner influence to take over the gangs from under Liberty's nose, raid Colorado Springs, and stop at simply killing the Patriarch and the marshals that stand in their way. I feel the need to reiterate, Angela's plan is to recruit a Raider to the squad. Have him empower the Raider gangs, bust down the gate of the semblance of civilization of Colorado, then trust that the Raider leader will keep his end of the bargain and lead his gangs off to Kansas rather than enslaving all the civilians now at his mercy, while he's running a gang comprised of a trio of Raiders that their entire philosophy is to torment others. A religious group that subsists off of human sacrifices. A gang which entire theme is augmentation and slavery. Another whose whole goal is to torture people for kicks. Cordite's not an idiot. He would realize that the Rangers would be his mortal enemies after this point, and the moment they start getting radio transmissions for help, they would head east for him. Besides, he needs all the resources he can get to conquer Kansas. It's out of character for him to keep his promise that he'll totally not raise Colorado Springs. You know, when you do this exact same thing with Matthias, he betrays you at the end. But that's not quite the same thing, he tricks you. If only we had an example of this exact same thing happening, and it ending up being a bad idea. Bonus points if it's from the exact same game. The worst part is that Angel's great strength in this argument is to appeal to a moral high ground, which actually works from the perspective of Rangers, because that's their whole shtick. The last thing she could possibly afford to be is hypocritical. Yet here she is, insisting the Patriarch can't be trusted because he works with Raiders, while insisting Team November works with Raiders to overthrow him. If it is this difficult to pull things off in Colorado, maybe he had a point. Not only that, Angela tries to get the squad to kill Valor because he's a potential useful idiot for political contenders. That's the least Ranger way thing I've ever heard, and sounds nothing like something Angela would do. She's impulsive, she appeals to greater acts of good, but sometimes doesn't weigh the consequences of them. She wouldn't commit to an act of political assassination, especially now when that's something the Patriarch would do if it wasn't his son. Has she been scouting out Kansas while she was AWOL? Maybe she could have given us that info, along with the rest we didn't get before getting ambushed and slaughtered by the dozens going to Colorado blind. The reality is that Angela's plan would likely condemn Colorado Springs, absolutely starve Arizona, and leave Kansas in an even more chaotic, bloody mess than it presumably is already. So many bodies, and for what? So we could take the Patriarch off his throne sooner than he's already intended to step off of it? The man might have less time to live than Arizona does. He's been at this for 50 years, he's already done. And he's already determined that he's not putting his kids in power because they're too stupid or evil. This plan is idiotic, hypocritical, and all it's done is deal with a problem that's set to resolve itself in the immediate future, while not accounting for the problem that will be the power vacuum left at his passing, one that we would be immediately accelerated into. Compare that to the Patriarch, where he cut to deal with the Raiders, but only after an extensive war with them, and he nearly wiped out the Dorseys, who were his most loyal family, after they insisted there was a transfer towards a democracy. I know mentioning the guys who just massacred and skinned our people wouldn't have been the most persuasive opening, but I'm kind of surprised Angela didn't open with that because that's far less justifiable. He suppressed the potential early uprising, but we honestly don't know for sure how the entire thing or the aftermath was going to play out, and he killed a lot of innocent people in doing so. But how am I supposed to resent this guy in comparison? Yes, the Patriarch would betray us the second we were a hindrance. He definitely had spies and Rangers loyal to him in our base, but he would only do these things when he couldn't come up with anything else. And he's very resourceful. He's shown to exaggerate his power in the museum, but the weirdly impressive part is that most of his propaganda is true. He waters down the brutality, but other than that, the Patriarch is, in fact, his hype. He did, in fact, beat back the monster army and saved the 100 families from devastation. He then spared them and allowed the army to become a merchant outpost. The refugee crisis wouldn't even have the opportunity of happening without him, not because of the abundance of raiders, but because these people wouldn't be taking refugees into their personal estate to begin with. If you kill some of his kids, but not all, he still fulfills his end of the bargain to a lesser degree. Angel has to have a damn good reason for me to betray the guy who has proven to be the best thing to happen in Colorado since the bombs fell, and willing to compromise when defies orders repeatedly. But she doesn't. He's an evil man who's done horrific things to build and maintain a city, and she can argue all those things. But why should we make the citizens of Colorado suffer by tearing it down when we could kill the raiders that made him so desperate to begin with? Must feel good to be able to justify that when we're the ones who are not going to starve or freeze to death. He'll accept democracy long before giving his kids power. Does he become a mad king as he mentally and physically degrades? No. Arguably he holds the power longer than he should, his nerves giving out before then, but he gives up the mantle before his mind does too. So the Rangers can either wait out his throne, or solve the conflict peacefully if they gain the power over Colorado to do so, making it a ridiculous prospect to ever support Angela in the most historically anti-Ranger actions I've ever seen. Wasteland 3 very obviously wants you to pick sides, and for some to be difficult with their pros and cons, but the Patriarch just has her too beat for this dynamic to work. I shouldn't be able to immediately shut down Angela's argument by asking how many must die so we can convince ourselves it wasn't our fault. One could argue the November Reigns ending where you overthrow the Patriarch peacefully is technically an Angela ending, but considering you have to actively go against her advice to solve this, I think it's an overly generous interpretation. It's also just a weird ending because it pretty much circumvents the entire thing, which doesn't really make sense to me thematically that there's an overall good ending when the game wants to make this difficult and nuanced crossroad. I don't much like it because it shifts the story from a state that was built off the altruistic against one built from pragmatism. To which poorly written power source do you prefer? The Patriarch is simultaneously far better written than Angela in this conflict, yet written to be too competent, and is already deep in set accomplishments for our interference to do anything positive of note. None of this mentions that the game will commit divine intervention if you try to take Angela off the board early. If you try to kill or arrest her in the first first scenario you actually meet, you're unable to during the combat scenario. And if you become hostile towards her after, she runs off in a scripted cutscene where Takayuki sacrifices himself to stop you somehow.
What? We don't shoot them!
Did you know that at any given point you can kill the Patriarch if you're skilled and lucky enough? They don't do this for Angela because they know they needed to finish off the finale's conflict. While killing her off wouldn't be able to set up a premature ending. They wanted to present the risk of having her available in person, yet wanted to prevent the player from being able to do anything about it. Wasteland 3's story is a complete mess, not capable of tying together exactly why these conflicts should occur, and fails to engage in that degree because of it, and at the risk of sounding redundant. As a result, the Patriarch comes off as honestly too reasonable in a brutal world, while Angela wants to take a course of action, don't change anything, other than doom 2 states worth of people. Who would even take the Patriarch's place immediately other than Mama Cotter, a character who self-admittedly refuses to make the hard decisions? She's a good person can't run Colorado. Not when your decisions will inevitably bring about someone's suffering. I don't know if they'll be making Wasteland 4, though it'll likely be in Kansas because they've done world building in Kansas and had Scotchmo, the character they seem keen on having be a supernatural comic relief, wander off to Kansas. I do hope they get a better sense of conflict in the setting and making certain sides seem more reasonable. To conclude this, Wasteland 2 is a more complex game mechanically, easier to master but more punishing, and I think the story is more compelling in what it has to say when it comes to Ranger's intervention. Wasteland 3 is far more simplistic, designed more around console play and less interactions in the role-playing aspect, but tries to make up for it in the complexity of gameplay and difficulty. What the game makes up for in its quality of life, it lacks in narrative shortcomings, and I think a lot of the charm of the second game had been lost in the streamlining. Not to say Wasteland 3 is a bad RPG, although I would in realms of story, but I do think it's an inferior product overall to the second title, outside of said quality of life changes. I honestly do hope there is an improvement that focuses more on the narrative, and tying it more to gameplay this next time around, though I suppose only time can tell whether that will even happen. I do appreciate you listening to what I had to say on the matter though, especially for so long. I hope you have a good day, and be safe.
Protecting the needy and fighting the greedy. We fought because we gave a shit, and we'll keep on fighting. For there's wrongs to be righting, and our victories grow year by year. 'Cause despite all the dangers, the old desert rangers, well, the world knows the rangers persevere.